She didn't even have a chair. Not a real one. Not at the adult table, anyway. Mara Ellison had driven 45 minutes to celebrate her cousin's engagement, wearing the dress she'd ironed twice, carrying a gift she couldn't really afford. And Aunt Celeste had pointed her toward the children's table without even looking up from her champagne glass. "There's a spot right there, sweetheart, next to little Marcus." Little Marcus was 9 years old and currently launching peas across the tablecloth. And then the laughter came, soft, polished, devastating, as someone at the adult table whispered something behind a perfectly manicured hand. Mara heard one word clearly: pathetic. If that had been you, sitting at a children's table while your family laughed, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have done something you could never take back? Because what happened next changed everything, and it started with a lie. Before we go further, if you're someone who's ever been overlooked by the people who are supposed to love you the most, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we bring you next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that garden. The invitation had said garden party, but what Celeste Harrow had actually thrown was closer to a theatrical production about her own good taste. The Harrow estate, and Celeste did call it an estate, despite it being a large suburban home with a catered backyard, had been transformed with white linen, trailing ivy, and small brass lanterns that served no real lighting purpose but photographed beautifully. There were waitstaff in matching black uniforms. There was a string quartet positioned near the hydrangeas. There was, Mara noticed immediately upon arrival, a seating chart. She found her name on it near the back. Between a 6-year-old and a child whose age she couldn't immediately determine because he was mostly under the table. Mara stood there holding her gift, a hand-tied box of the bakery's salted caramel tarts, Grandma Ruth's recipe, which had taken her until 11 the previous night to perfect, and she breathed through her nose slowly, the way her therapist had suggested, the way she'd been doing it for years when this family made her feel small. She was 30 years old, she owned a business, she paid her taxes, paid her staff, and paid her mortgage on a building she'd bought before she turned 28. She was sitting next to a child who had peas on his shirt. "Mara, you made it!" Her cousin Deja appeared, looking genuinely happy to see her, which was a relief because Mara had been on the verge of getting back in her car. Deja squeezed her arm warmly and lowered her voice. "I'm sorry about the seating. Aunt Celeste did it herself. I told her—" "It's fine," Mara said, because saying it's not fine at a family event was its own kind of exhaustion. You spent more energy defending the complaint than whatever wounded you in the first place. Deja looked at her with that expression people get when they know something isn't fine and also know there's nothing useful they can do about it. "The food is incredible, at least, and the bar is open." "Where's the bar?" "Thank goodness," Mara muttered and followed her cousin through the garden. The Harrow side of Mara's family had always operated on a specific kind of social physics. Success was measured by certain visible things: a husband, a house, a job title that sounded important, even if nobody knew exactly what it meant. Mara had none of those things in the configuration her family understood. She had a bakery. She had flour on her work shoes most mornings. She had a studio apartment she loved, and a social life that had contracted significantly over the past 3 years as she poured everything into Ellison and Rye. Her grandmother Ruth had told her once that some people couldn't love what they didn't understand. Mara had been 23 when Ruth said that, sitting in the old kitchen on Clover Street with butter on her hands, and she'd thought her grandmother was being wise in a comforting, abstract way. She was 30 now. She understood it was just the truth, delivered gently. She got a glass of white wine and positioned herself near a floral arrangement large enough to partially hide behind. She'd done the math on these events. If she stayed near the perimeter, smiled at the right moments, and avoided her Aunt Celeste's line of sight for the first hour, she could usually get through it without any major incident. That calculation went sideways at approximately 2:14 in the afternoon. That was when Vanessa arrived. Mara heard the reaction before she saw her cousin, a ripple of genuine collective delight that moved through the garden like something choreographed. Vanessa Harrow was 28, tall and beautiful in the specific way that seemed effortless, but was actually, Mara knew from years of proximity, a full-time occupation. She had the family's cheekbones, their mother's smile, and currently, on her left hand, a diamond engagement ring that caught the afternoon light like a small, concentrated star. Beside her was Gavin. Gavin Price. Mara's glass stopped halfway to her lips. She'd known he would be here. Intellectually. She'd known it for 3 weeks since the invitation arrived, and she'd seen his name on the couple's joint social media announcement. She'd prepared herself. She'd talked herself through it in her car on the way over, the same way you talk yourself through a medical procedure. You acknowledge that it will be unpleasant. You remind yourself it will end. You breathe. She had not adequately prepared for the specific way he smiled at something Vanessa said, that particular slow smile that Mara had once believed was something he reserved for her. Gavin Price was 34, professionally handsome, and had the bearing of a man who'd never once doubted he belonged in any room he entered. He and Mara had dated for 14 months, ending 2 years ago in a conversation so civilized it had felt somehow worse than a fight. He had never raised his voice. He had simply explained with calm and inexplicable confidence that Mara was too focused on the bakery right now to be a real partner, that she needed to figure out what she wanted from life before she could offer someone else anything meaningful. He had said this in her kitchen, the kitchen she'd renovated herself. Then he had walked out and apparently promptly begun dating her cousin. Mara had found this out the same way she found out most things about her family's business. Through a group chat she was technically still in but rarely spoke in. She had not, she realized now, watching Vanessa extend her ringed hand toward a cluster of admirers, fully processed this. There was a layer of it she'd wrapped tightly and placed somewhere interior and never really opened. Standing 8 feet away from Gavin Price, while he put his arm around her cousin's waist, she felt that layer begin to peel. She turned back toward the floral arrangement. Mara. Aunt Celeste's voice, warm in the way that always meant something sharp was coming. Don't hide back there. Come see Vanessa's ring. Come on. Come. And Celeste steered her forward with both hands on Mara's shoulders, presenting her to the gathered admirers of Vanessa's engagement like a footnote being added to a document. Mara, doesn't it just take your breath away? Celeste said, nodding at the ring. It's beautiful, Mara said. We're just so happy, Vanessa said, and to her credit, she looked directly at Mara when she said it, and her eyes were careful and complicated. Mara, I'm glad you came. Of course, Mara said. Gavin looked at her, not uncomfortably. That was the thing about Gavin. He never looked uncomfortable. Hey, Mara. Good to see you. You too, she said. And those 6 words were, combined, the most exhausting sentence she'd ever constructed. The group moved on, Celeste's hand still steering this social chess piece to this square, now that square. Mara caught a glass of champagne from a passing tray and tried to locate an escape route with her peripheral vision. She didn't find one fast enough, because within 20 minutes she was seated at the children's table with a napkin in her lap, and Celeste was giving what could only be described as a toast that wasn't a toast. Standing at the head of the adult table, champagne raised, performing love for her daughter while delivering, with surgical precision, a kind of ambient commentary on everyone else. She talked about Vanessa finding her person. She talked about the importance of not letting life pass you by. She talked about how she'd always known Gavin was special. Said this without looking at Mara, which was, Mara suspected, more deliberate than accidental. Then she turned her gaze across the garden with a wide, inclusive smile. And we're just so grateful everyone could join us today. Even our little Mara, all the way over there at the kids' table. We love you, honey. Light laughter, not cruel exactly. That was the thing about Celeste. She was never cruel in a way you could point to clearly. She was cruel in a way that made you question yourself for being hurt by it. One of Mara's other aunts, Bernadette, the nice one, made a sympathetic face across the garden, which somehow made it worse. Celeste continued. Of course, Mara's still finding her path. At 30, there's still time. The bakery keeps you busy, I know, and someday when you find your person, I have one, Mara said. She hadn't planned to say it. The words came out of her mouth the way certain things escape, pressure that is built past the point where it can be managed. Her voice was steady. She was faintly surprised by that. Celeste blinked. Excuse me? I have someone, Mara said. A boyfriend. We've been together for... She did the math, fast and desperate. Several months. It's serious. The garden was quiet. Not completely. The string quartet was still playing something gentle, and little Marcus had just knocked a fork off the table. But the conversational layer had gone very still. Celeste smiled slowly. The smile of someone who thought they knew the territory and was about to test the border. Well, that's wonderful, Mara. Why didn't you bring him? Excellent question, Aunt Celeste. He had a commitment this morning, Mara said. He might be able to come later. He might be able to come later. She was referring to a person who did not exist. What does he do? Someone asked. Mara couldn't tell who. Her focus had narrowed to a fine point. He's an acquisitions executive, she said. Her brain had reached into some recent folder. A business card, she realized, that had been slipped under the bakery door 2 weeks ago from some corporate developer she'd been deliberately ignoring. He works in acquisitions and investment. Ooh, someone said. What's his name? And for reasons she would spend considerable time analyzing later, the name on that business card surfaced with perfect, unhelpful clarity. Kieran, Mara said. Kieran Vale. She lasted 11 more minutes before she left the garden. She told a child named Harper that she needed to get something from her car, and Harper, who was 7 and occupied with a cupcake, did not attempt to stop her. Mara walked through the side gate with the measured, unhurried stride of a person who was not experiencing a quiet internal collapse. And then, when she reached the parking lot, she pressed her back against the brick wall beside the gate and closed her eyes. What had she done? What had she done? Her phone had 32 minutes of battery left. She had exactly as long as it would take Celeste Harrow to either forget the conversation or organize a search party to find her. She needed a plan, and she needed one immediately, and every single option available to her was awful. She could go back in and say she'd been joking. That was humiliating in a different direction. She could leave entirely. But her gift was still on the gift table, and leaving it felt like abandonment, which was irrational. But here she was. She could, and this thought arrived with the particular absurdity of thoughts born from panic, find someone willing to spend 1 hour pretending to be a wealthy man named Kieran Vale. Mara opened her eyes. There was a car at the far end of the parking lot. Not a car. A vehicle. Black, expensive, the kind of low, quiet luxury that didn't advertise itself but also didn't have to. And leaning against it, or rather, standing beside it in the way certain people stand beside things, as though they own the immediate surrounding space, was a man. Tall, dark jacket, the kind of controlled posture that didn't come from good breeding or good tailoring, but from something older and harder than either. I was looking at his phone with the focused concentration of someone reviewing something important, but Mara noticed, distantly, with the part of her brain still capable of observation, that his eyes moved at regular intervals to scan the parking lot entrance, then back to his phone, then to the entrance again. A habit, she thought, not anxiety. Habit. She walked toward him because she was out of options, and he was there, and sometimes the geography of desperation makes the decision for you. He looked up when she was about 10 feet away. Not startled, just alert, the way a person is alert when they've been paying attention to their surroundings the whole time. Hi, Mara said. Hi, he said. His voice was low, accented in some way she couldn't immediately place, traces of something that had been worn smooth by years but hadn't completely disappeared. This is going to sound insane, Mara said. He waited. I need someone to pretend to be my boyfriend for approximately 1 hour. She said it the way you say something when you've decided that hesitation is no longer an available luxury. There's a family party happening on the other side of that gate. I told my aunt I had a boyfriend. I don't. If I go back in there without one, the next hour of my life is going to be... She paused, searching for the word. Extraordinarily unpleasant. I will pay you. I have $40 in my wallet, and the rest is in my account, but I can... What's his name? The man said. Mara blinked. I'm sorry? The boyfriend. Something in his expression had changed, though she couldn't have described exactly how. Not more open, not closed, something more careful. What name did you give him? Kieran, she said. Kieran Vale. The man looked at her for a moment that lasted approximately 2 full seconds and felt considerably longer. That's my name, he said. Mara stared at him. Kieran Vale, he said, as though the clarification was necessary, which it absolutely was. The world had a quality in that moment of a dream sequence in a film where the physics briefly stopped behaving normally. Mara heard the string quartet faintly through the garden wall. She heard a car somewhere on the street behind her. She heard, she thought, her own pulse doing something irregular. You're, she started. Yes, he said. And your name is actually, yes. She looked at the card holder that was, she could now see, visible in the inside breast pocket of his jacket. She had sent a business card under her bakery door. He had put that card in his pocket. He had driven to this address. Why? She said carefully. Do you have business cards with your name on them in the parking lot of my cousin's engagement party? I was here to meet someone, he said. Who? Kieran Vale looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. I'll tell you later, he said. Do you still need a date? Mara looked at this stranger who shared a name with the man she'd invented, who had appeared in the parking lot where she'd fled, who watched entrance points as a reflex and spoke with a quiet authority she couldn't explain, and whose presence radiated something she couldn't name but could feel like a change in air pressure. Every reasonable instinct she possessed said, no. Go back inside and fall on your sword. Tell Celeste you made it up. Absorb the laughter. Yes, Mara said. Kieran Vale pushed off from the car. Then let's go, he said. And Mara Ellison walked back through that garden gate with a stranger on her arm, a stranger whose name she'd pulled from a business card and breathed into existence, and who had somehow materialized in a parking lot like a story deciding to write itself. She did not know yet what he was. She only knew that when they stepped through the gate together, every head in the garden turned, and nobody was laughing anymore. The first thing Mara noticed when she walked back through that gate was the silence. Not complete silence. The string quartet was still playing, glasses were still clinking, someone's child was still running laps around a hydrangea bush. But the conversational layer, the layer of polite chatter and social filler that had been running continuously since she'd arrived, that layer simply stopped, like someone had put a thumb on a record. Every adult head turned. Mara felt it the way you feel a temperature change. That specific particular awareness of being the center of a room's attention. Not the warm kind of center, not the celebrated kind, but the examined kind. The kind where people are doing math behind their eyes. She kept walking. Kieran Vale walked beside her, not half a step behind, not half a step in front. Beside her, at exactly the pace she set, and the precision of that felt intentional in a way she couldn't explain without sounding paranoid. His hands were in his pockets. His jacket didn't move. He looked at the garden the way a person looks at a space they're assessing rather than admiring, and somehow that came across not as coldness, but as a specific and total kind of attention. Mara's Aunt Celeste had frozen near the champagne table with a flute halfway to her mouth. That image alone made the whole thing almost worth it. Your aunt, Kieran said quietly, without turning his head. The woman in the yellow dress who looks like she's having a stroke. That's her, Mara said. She's coming toward us. I know. Are you ready? Mara took a breath. Absolutely not. Good, he said, and something about the flatness of it made her want to laugh, which was insane, because nothing about this situation was funny. Celeste Harrow covered the distance between them with the precise velocity of a woman who had important social business to conduct and would not be delayed by minor obstacles like other people's conversations. She had rearranged her face into an expression of delighted warmth that Mara recognized as the one she deployed when something required managing. Mara, Celeste said, and then her eyes moved to Kieran, and she said nothing else for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds is not a long time. In this case, it was long enough to communicate an entire paragraph. This is Kieran, Mara said. Kieran, my Aunt Celeste. Kieran removed one hand from his pocket and extended it. Mrs. Harrow. His handshake, Mara observed, was the kind that didn't ask for anything. Firm, brief, complete. Celeste took it with the slightly dazed expression of a woman who had expected to be in charge of this interaction and was recalibrating in real time. Well, Celeste said. Well, hello, we've heard so much. She stopped, because she had heard nothing, because Mara had announced this relationship approximately 25 minutes ago. We're so glad you could make it. Mara mentioned the party, Kieran said. I wanted to see where she grew up. He glanced at Mara with an expression so perfectly calibrated to the specific frequency of fond affection that she felt her chest do something involuntary. She doesn't talk about her family enough. Celeste blinked. No, well, Mara's always been very focused, Kieran said pleasantly. She is. It's one of the things I noticed about her first, actually. He said it the same way you state a fact you consider self-evident. Not romantic, just certain. Celeste looked at Mara. Mara looked back at Celeste with the careful neutrality of a person holding a winning hand they haven't shown yet. Come, Celeste said finally, recovering. Come meet everyone. The next 40 minutes were an education. Mara had grown up watching her family operate, knew all its pressure points and fault lines, knew which aunt deflated when ignored and which uncle performed better with an audience. She had attended enough of these events to have developed a detailed internal map of the social terrain. She thought she understood the choreography. What she hadn't accounted for was what happened when you introduced a variable the system hadn't processed before. Kieran Vale was that variable. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't dominate conversations or try to hold court the way men sometimes did at these events when they wanted to establish something. He was simply present in a way that had texture. When he spoke, it was because he had something specific to say. When he listened, he actually listened. Not the nodding, half-tracking kind of listening that most people performed at parties, but the kind where his eyes stayed on your face and you had the faint, unnerving sense that he was filing things. Uncle Bernard, who could talk about his investment portfolio for 45 minutes without pausing, asked Kieran what sector he worked in. Acquisitions, Kieran said. Commercial? Residential? Both. Distressed assets, primarily. Companies that are undervalued or mismanaged. A pause. And occasionally the reverse, things that are working exactly as they should, that other people want to dismantle. Bernard nodded with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he'd found a peer. Smart money's been in restructuring for the last. It depends on what you're trying to preserve, Kieran said. And something in his tone ended that branch of conversation without rudeness, just a clean, quiet close. Bernard nodded again, more slowly this time. Mara watched this from 2 feet away and thought, he does that a lot, doesn't he? Closes things down without anyone being able to say exactly how. She filed it next to the door watching, the parking lot alertness, the way his posture never quite fully relaxed. She wasn't afraid of him exactly, but she was aware of him in the way you're aware of something that doesn't follow the rules of the environment you're in. Gavin found them near the dessert table. Mara had been half expecting it, in the way you half expect something you've been dreading. Not surprised when it happens, just confirmed. He appeared at her left shoulder with a glass of something amber and a smile that was entirely surface. Mara. Then, with the performance of a man being magnanimous, and you must be the boyfriend we've been hearing about. Kieran, Mara said, because it was her job now, apparently, to do this. Gavin. The 2 men shook hands. Mara watched both their faces and took in precisely nothing she could clearly read. Good to finally meet you, Gavin said. Is it? Kieran said. A beat. Small. Nobody else would have caught it. Of course, Gavin said, recalibrating. Mara doesn't bring many. I mean, it's good she has someone now. The bakery can be all-consuming. He looked at Mara with the specific species of warmth that comes from people who have decided their past behavior is behind them and expect everyone else to have processed that faster than they have. She puts everything into that place. She built something worth putting everything into, Kieran said. Gavin's smile stayed. Sure, absolutely. The little bakery's doing well. I've driven past it a few times. Cute neighborhood spot. Mara felt the specific calibrated sting of that. Little. Cute. Words shaped to sound like compliments and land like diminishments. Kieran picked up a dessert fork from the table and turned it once in his fingers, like a man with nothing in particular on his mind. What's the revenue range for cute neighborhood spot in your assessment? He said. Gavin blinked. Sorry? I'm asking because Ellison and Rye has been operating profitably for 4 years in a market where 60% of independent food businesses close within the first 3. Kieran set the fork down. That's not a cute neighborhood spot. That's a successful small business in a brutal industry run by someone who had no outside capital and no family money behind her. I'm just curious where cute fits into that analysis. The garden had done that thing again. That quiet thing. Gavin's smile didn't fall exactly. It just stopped reaching any part of his face above his mouth. I only meant, he started. What have you built entirely by yourself? Kieran said. He didn't say it aggressively. That was the thing. He said it the way you ask a logistical question at a business meeting. Politely. Expecting an answer. Gavin opened his mouth, closed it. The amber drink in his hand seemed to suddenly require attention. "I've had a lot of irons in the fire," he finally said. "I'm sure," Kieran said, and turned back to Mara. Mara kept her face neutral through pure force of will, which was considerable, because what she wanted to do was laugh until she cried or possibly cry until she laughed, and neither seemed appropriate for a garden party at which she was already operating at a significant structural disadvantage. "The salted caramel ones are yours," Kieran said quietly, nodding at the dessert display where Mara's tarts had been arranged. She noticed at the far end of the table behind the caterer's offerings. "My grandmother's recipe," Mara said. He picked one up, tried it, didn't perform any reaction, which she found, oddly, more flattering than if he had. "She knew what she was doing," he said. "Yes," Mara said, "she did." The plate happened without announcement. Mara had been managing the performance for nearly 90 minutes by then, smiling at the right times, standing close enough to Kieran to look credible, fielding questions about how they'd met with a story she was building in real time and would absolutely not be able to replicate consistently if pressed. And she hadn't eaten anything since a piece of toast at 7 that morning. She didn't register this consciously. She was running on adrenaline and white wine and the specific fuel source of sustained social anxiety, and the food was across the garden, and accessing it required navigating Celeste's orbit, which she was rationing carefully. She registered it when a plate appeared in her peripheral vision. Not offered, just there, at her elbow, with a quiet logistical efficiency that suggested the person placing it had noticed the problem some time ago and had simply dealt with it. Kieran was already in conversation with one of her uncles on the other side of her. He hadn't said anything, hadn't made it a moment, had just noticed she hadn't eaten and done something about it. Mara looked at the plate, and then at him, and then at the plate again. She ate, standing up, next to a man she'd known for less than 2 hours, and felt something complicated and slightly alarming move through her chest. She told herself it was the food stabilizing her blood sugar. She almost believed it. Celeste struck at the 2-hour mark. Mara should have been ready for it. Celeste Harrow did not allow unfamiliar elements into her social productions without eventually testing their structural integrity. She'd been circling for an hour, appearing at intervals to redirect conversations and introduce Kieran to various family members with the strategic precision of a woman who was gathering information while appearing to distribute warmth. The trap, when it came, wore the costume of a spontaneous suggestion. "We should dance," Celeste announced to the garden at large, and the string quartet, who had been hired specifically to enable exactly this kind of suggestion, transitioned smoothly into something with a waltz structure. Vanessa and Gavin, obviously. She gestured at the couple, who moved obligingly toward the small stone area that served as a dance floor. "And everyone else, come on, don't be shy." She looked directly at Mara. "Mara, darling, surely you and Kieran—" It was a test. Mara felt the shape of it clearly. Celeste had decided that whatever was happening between Mara and this man was either real or not, and a convincing public performance of physical ease would either confirm or destroy the answer. Mara looked at Kieran. Kieran was already looking at her. He held out his hand. Not with a flourish, not with any theatrical weight, just extended it, palm up, the same way you'd offer someone help over an uneven curb. A simple, practical offer. Mara took it. His hand was larger than she'd expected, which was irrational to notice, but she noticed it. And warm. And his grip was exactly firm enough to communicate steadiness without communicating control. They moved on to the stone floor. He could dance. That was the first thing Mara confirmed, which was both a relief and a new complication, because a man who can actually dance changes the chemistry of the exercise entirely. He didn't lead in a way that felt like being steered. He led in a way that felt like being given information, small signals through pressure and weight distribution that told her where they were going before they went there. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "I'm doing terribly," Mara said. "My smile has been wrong for the last 10 minutes. "Your smile is fine." "You haven't looked at my smile in 10 minutes. "I've been looking at your smile every 30 seconds for the last 2 hours, he said, and Mara stumbled slightly, not from the dancing. He steadied her without making it a thing. "You're watching a lot," she said carefully. "I always watch." "Why?" A pause that lasted 3 steps. "Old habit." "From what?" He looked at her. Full attention, the kind she'd observed him deploying on everyone else, and that felt, when turned directly on you, considerably more intense. I'll answer that later. You keep saying later, she said. I keep meaning later, he said. There's a difference. Mara turned this over while they danced. Around them, the garden had softened. Other couples moving, the light changing as the afternoon angled lower, the lanterns beginning to actually serve their lighting purpose as the sky shifted color. Her Aunt Celeste was watching from the edge of the floor with an expression Mara couldn't fully read from this distance. Not warm, not cold, something that looked, improbably, like reassessment. Your ex-boyfriend is watching us, as Kieran said. I know. He doesn't look happy. I know. Do you care? Mara thought about it honestly, the way you think about things when you're tired of answering questions the way you're supposed to. I thought I would. I thought standing here with you, with him watching, I thought I'd feel some kind of triumph, satisfaction, something pointed. But I just feel tired, she said. Tired in a way I don't think is about Gavin. Kieran said nothing. That's too honest, Mara said. I don't know why I said that. Because you're tired of performing, he said. The simplicity of it landed somewhere central. She didn't respond. They danced another half-minute, and she thought about how strange it was that the most honest conversation she'd had all afternoon had been with a stranger she'd recruited in a parking lot. You stopped performing about 40 minutes ago, Kieran added. Is it that obvious? Only from here. She looked at him. When did you stop? He met her eyes. Didn't answer. Which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. The black sedan arrived at 4:18 p.m. Mara noticed it first because she'd been facing the garden entrance, and because any new vehicle in a residential street during a private party tends to draw the eye. It parked with the smooth finality of a vehicle being placed rather than left. And the man who stepped out of it was older, 60s, gray-haired, compact in the way that people are compact when the mass they carry is not fat, but something harder than that. He walked through the garden gate without hesitating. Didn't look for a host. Didn't make any social gesture toward the assembled guests. He found Kieran with his eyes from 20 feet away and walked directly toward him. Kieran saw him coming. Something changed in his posture. So small and so immediate that Mara almost missed it. A settling. The way a structure settles when weight is applied to it that it knows how to carry. I need a word, the older man said. His voice was low. The sentence was not addressed to Mara, not directed away from her, just stated to the air between them with an implicit clarity that the word he needed did not involve an audience. Give me a moment, Kieran said. The man nodded, stepped back 3 feet, stood with his hands at his sides and waited with the practiced patience of someone who had spent significant time waiting in the proximity of people who required space. The garden, Mara noticed, had developed a new frequency. She registered it in phases. First a change in Deja's face across the garden, a recognition that sharpened into something else. Then her uncle Bernard, who had stopped mid-sentence with someone and was staring at the older man with an expression Mara couldn't name immediately, and then could. It was the expression you made when you recognized something you hadn't expected to encounter here, in this setting. Something that didn't belong in the same category as string quartets and champagne flutes. A whisper reached her from somewhere to the left. She didn't catch all of it. She caught a name. She caught an affiliation. She watched Bernard move 2 steps away from where the man was standing, casually, the way people move casually when they are not feeling casual at all. Mara turned to Kieran. He was looking at her. Not with apology. Not with performance. With something that was simply direct. An acknowledgement that the geography of this moment had shifted and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Kieran, she said. Yes. Who is he? A pause. Brief and considered. Someone who works with me. What do you do? Mara asked. And she wasn't asking about acquisitions now. She wasn't asking about investment portfolios or commercial real estate. She was asking the question underneath the question, the one she'd been assembling from pieces all afternoon. The door watching, the posture, the way he spoke to Gavin with such measured authority, the man standing 10 feet away who had turned her Uncle Bernard pale. Kieran looked at her with those careful eyes. Later, he said. Kieran. I know, he said quietly. I know I keep saying that. The people at this party, Mara said, keeping her voice low, steady, are looking at your associate the way my uncle looks at weather reports that are predicting something very bad. I noticed. Do you want to explain that? Yes, Kieran said. I do. Just. He glanced toward the older man, then back to her. Not here. Not with Celeste Harrow 4 meters away with excellent hearing. Despite everything, Mara felt her mouth twitch. Okay, she said, but after he's done with you, we're having a conversation. I know, Kieran said. And then, so quietly, she almost didn't catch it. It's a conversation I've been planning to have anyway. Today just moved the timeline. Then he walked toward the older man, and they moved together toward the garden's far edge. And Mara stood with her champagne and watched Vanessa's beautiful engagement party quietly reorganize itself around an absence it couldn't explain. Across the stone floor, Gavin's phone lit up. He looked at the screen, and the expression that crossed his face was one Mara had never seen there before. Not in 14 months of dating him, not in 2 years of carefully curated social encounters afterward. She had seen Gavin Price confident and dismissive and occasionally cruel in the understated way that charming people could afford to be. She had seen him perform warmth he didn't entirely feel, and success he was still constructing. She had never seen him afraid. His phone lit up again. He turned away from the party, away from Vanessa, away from Celeste, away from the assembled witnesses of his successful future, and pressed the phone to his ear. Mara watched him listen. She watched the color change in his face. She watched his hand, the one not holding the phone, close into a fist at his side, and then open, and then close again. She didn't know yet what the call contained. She didn't know yet the architecture of the thing Gavin had been quietly building for 2 years, the structure he had constructed on the foundation of her grandmother's recipes, and her stubborn refusal to fail. She didn't know yet that the reason her bakery had been under sustained pressure to sell was connected to the man standing at the engagement party. The man who was supposed to be celebrating the acquisition of her cousin alongside his own financial future. She didn't know yet, but she looked at Gavin Price across that garden, and something old and patient and long-suffering inside her chest very quietly paid attention. Kieran returned to her side 7 minutes later. He stood next to her without preamble, without performance, and looked at the same direction she was looking, at Gavin, still on his phone, still pale, still making that motion with his free hand. We need to talk, Kieran said. Yes, Mara said. We do. Not here. No, she agreed. There's a bench on the east side of the garden, behind the rose trellis. I saw it when we came in. Of course he had. Give me 5 minutes, Mara said. She was going to need 5 minutes because she had just realized, standing there watching Gavin Price grip his phone with the specific tension of a man receiving news that dismantles a plan he thought was permanent, that whatever Kieran Vale was going to tell her behind that rose trellis was going to be information she could not unknow, and that everything that came after was going to be impossible to take back. She finished her champagne, she put the glass down on a passing tray, and she walked toward the east side of the garden where a man she'd invented had been waiting in a parking lot to tell her something that was going to change the shape of everything she thought she understood about her own life. The string quartet played on. Gavin's phone lit up a third time. And somewhere behind the rose trellis, Kieran Vale was already waiting, with the particular patience of a man who had been waiting, in one form or another, for considerably longer than one afternoon. The bench behind the rose trellis was cold. Mara noticed that first, the stone was cold even through her dress, even though the afternoon had been warm, because the trellis blocked the sun and the air back here was different from the garden air, quieter, less performed. You could still hear the string quartet, but it was muffled enough to sound like a memory of music rather than actual music. Kieran sat beside her, but not close. There was a foot of space between them, which felt both appropriate and strange, given that for the last 2 hours they had been performing an intimacy that required proximity, and now that the performance was suspended, the distance announced itself. He didn't start talking immediately. That was the thing about him, Mara was learning. He didn't fill silence out of discomfort. He let it exist until he had something specific to put into it. Most people she knew couldn't do that. She found it simultaneously calming and unnerving, like standing at the edge of a very still body of water. How much do you know, he said finally, about the development group that's been approaching your neighborhood? Mara looked at him. Meridian Capital. Yes. They've been trying to buy out properties on Clover Street for 2 years. I've had 3 meetings with their representatives. All 3 times I said no." She paused. "They sent a formal letter 8 months ago that my lawyer described as aggressively optimistic." "What did they want with Ellison and Rye specifically?" "They want the whole block. The bakery sits at the corner. Without that corner, the development footprint they need doesn't work." She'd had this conversation with her lawyer, with her accountant, with her grandmother's oldest friend who still came in every Tuesday for a cinnamon roll and coffee. She knew the geometry of it. "They can't build what they want to build without my building." Kieran was quiet. "You already knew that," Mara said. "Yes." "How?" He turned toward her on the bench. Not fully. One arm rested along the back of it, his body angled so he was looking at her directly, but not cornering her. She noticed he was consistent about that, consistent about leaving exits. "Meridian Capital's development financing," he said, "came through a holding fund called Arrowwood Consolidated. Arrowwood is a mid-sized investment vehicle with interests in commercial real estate across 5 states. He stopped. "I own a controlling share in Arrowwood." The string quartet played something that might have been a Brahms intermezzo, very far away. "You own part of the fund," Mara said slowly, "that has been financing the company that's been trying to take my building." "Yes." The word landed flat and without apology, which she found, counterintuitively, more tolerable than if he'd softened it. "That's why you were in the parking lot," Mara said. "I came to the party to find you," Kieran said. "Not the party specifically. I knew from the catering van outside and the property records that the Harrow address was connected to you. You'd been at the bakery until 11 last night. Your assistant confirmed you'd be here this afternoon." He paused. "I was waiting until the event had settled before approaching." "Your associate," Mara said. "The man who came to find you." "Edmund. He handles logistics." "Edmund made my uncle look like he'd swallowed something bad." "Edmund has that effect." Something crossed Kieran's face that wasn't quite humor. "It's useful in some contexts." Mara stood up. Not from anger exactly, from the specific physical need to not be sitting when she processed things. She took 3 steps toward the trellis, looked at the roses without seeing them, and then turned back. "So you came here to offer to buy my bakery?" "No," Kieran said. "Then what?" "I came to tell you that as of this morning, the Arrowwood financing for Meridian Capital's development project has been terminated." He held her gaze. "The project is dead. Meridian loses their funding structure, which means they lose their timeline, which means they lose the property commitments they've already made to the other sellers on your block. The whole thing collapses." Mara stared at him. "I terminated it at 9:14 this morning," Kieran said. "Before I drove to this address. Before I was standing in that parking lot. Before you walked across the asphalt and asked me to pretend to be your boyfriend." He said it without emphasis, just sequentially, as though the order of events was simply a fact worth being precise about. "Your bakery was already safe when you found me." The music from the garden drifted over the trellis. Somewhere on the other side, Mara could hear her cousin Deja laughing at something, that full laugh she'd had since they were children, and the contrast between that sound and the information currently reorganizing itself inside Mara's chest was almost physically disorienting. "Why?" she said. "Why did I terminate it? Why did you fund it in the first place? Why did you? If you knew what they were doing to Clover Street, to the people who've been there for decades, why did Arrowwood's money go into it at all?" Kieran was quiet for a moment. The real kind. Not the considering kind. The kind where he was deciding how much of something to say. "Because 2 years ago," he said, "I didn't know Ellison and Rye existed." Mara waited. "I have interests in a significant number of holdings. Arrowwood backs projects across multiple cities. 2 years ago, Meridian Capital presented a commercially reasonable development proposal, and Arrowwood provided financing based on standard analysis." He paused. "I don't personally review every project at that level, but you reviewed this one." "Eventually," he said, "when the reports started coming across my desk about the property on Clover Street that refused to move. Refused 2 offers. Refused 3. Returned a lawyer's letter unsigned." Something shifted in his expression. There was a notation in one report that said the owner had told the Meridian representative, and this is a direct quote from the development file, "This bakery was built on my grandmother's hands and will outlast your spreadsheet." Mara remembered saying that. She remembered the Meridian representative's face when she'd said it, a young man in an expensive suit who had looked at her with the kind of respectful incomprehension people reserved for someone making an obviously irrational decision. I had Edmund pull the full file on the property, Kieran said. The ownership history, the business registration, the original building permits. He stopped. When I saw the name Ellison, and then looked at the menu that was attached as a market research document, he stopped again. And this pause was different from the others. This one had weight in it. The recipes, Mara said. Something cold moved through her. You recognize the recipes? Kieran looked at her steadily. There's a cinnamon roll on your menu. The description says it uses a brown butter base with hand-ground spices, no commercial extract. There's a note that says Grandma Ruth's method, unchanged. Mara's mouth had stopped working. The same roll, Kieran said, was made for me approximately 140 times over the course of 11 months by a woman named Ruth Ellison in a bakery on Clover Street when I was 19 years old and had been in this country for 4 months. The rose trellis was very still, no wind. The music had paused, a break between pieces, and for approximately 4 seconds, the garden behind them was completely silent. She knew you, Mara said. I don't know what she knew, Kieran said. She never asked me questions I wasn't ready to answer. She never made the food conditional on anything. I came in one morning because I was cold and I didn't have anywhere specific to be, and she put a plate in front of me and she said, He stopped. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to conceal or manage, and Mara found that more striking than anything else she'd seen from him all afternoon. She said, Sit down and eat. You look like you're carrying something heavy. Mara's grandmother had said that to her too, approximately 40 times over the course of 30 years. It was her universal diagnostic for people in her presence who were struggling. I ate, Kieran said. I came back the next day, and the next, for 11 months. He looked at his hands for a moment. The direction I was moving in, at 19, in a new country with no resources and no connections, and a specific set of skills that certain people found useful, your grandmother interrupted that trajectory. He looked back at her. I don't know if she understood what she was doing. I think she might have. She was the kind of woman who understood more than she said. Mara pressed one hand flat against the stone trellis beside her because she needed something solid. Ruth Ellison had been dead for 6 years. Mara had sat with her in that same bakery kitchen on Clover Street at the end, when Ruth was 81, and her hands shook but her eyes were still completely clear, and Ruth had told her, You keep the recipes exactly, baby. Don't let anyone modernize them. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. She had not mentioned a 19-year-old she had fed for 11 months. She had not mentioned a name. But then Ruth Ellison had also never kept a list of the people she'd quietly helped. She would have considered that a kind of bookkeeping that had nothing to do with why you helped someone. Protecting Clover Street, Mara said. Her voice came out lower than she expected. Blocking the development. That was a debt, Kieran said simply. A debt I've been trying to identify for 17 years and only found 8 months ago when a report landed on my desk about a bakery that wouldn't sell. Mara turned away from him because she needed a moment where he couldn't see her face. She looked at the roses in the trellis. Red ones, meticulously maintained, which was very Celeste. Celeste had a gardener who came twice a week to make sure everything in this garden was exactly what it was supposed to be. Mara thought about her grandmother standing at the counter on Clover Street at 6 in the morning, putting food in front of a 19-year-old she didn't know, asking nothing in return. She thought about how Ruth had done that kind of thing her entire life. Quiet, unremarked, consistent. The neighborhood knew. The regulars knew. Mara had grown up watching it and absorbing it the way you absorb the things that are just part of the air of a place. She hadn't known it would come back. She hadn't known it had traveled this far. She turned back to Kieran. You said, she said carefully, that Gavin is connected to this. Kieran's expression shifted. That settling quality again, weight being assumed. Yes. Tell me. Meridian Capital has a local liaison, Kieran said. Someone with family connections to the Clover Street neighborhood who provided background information on the properties and the owners. Social history, resistance points, financial pressure analysis. He paused. The liaison's arrangement was contingent on the development succeeding. His expected payout was substantial. Mara heard the word substantial and felt something in her stomach drop to approximately the level of the cold stone beneath her feet. Gavin, she said. For the past 18 months, Kieran said, Gavin Price has been Meridian Capital's primary inside contact for the Clover Street acquisition project. The afternoon light was doing that thing it did in late summer, going gold and slightly thickened, and it came through the gaps in the rose trellis in specific patterns across the stone bench where they were sitting. And Mara looked at those patterns because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that wasn't Kieran's face while she processed what she was holding. Gavin Price had dated her for 14 months. He had sat across from her in her kitchen, the one she'd renovated herself, the one above the bakery that smelled like butter and cinnamon on baking mornings, and told her she needed to figure out what she wanted from life. He had then, apparently, determined that what he wanted from his life involved the financial destruction of the things she'd built from her grandmother's legacy. He had sat at Celeste Harrow's elegant adult table today, in front of the family that was already inclined to underestimate Mara, and called Ellison and Rye a little bakery. How long, Mara said, and her voice was very quiet and very controlled in the way that voices sometimes get when what they are containing is large enough that loudness would lose it entirely. How long has he been doing this? His first contact with Meridian was 22 months ago, Kieran said, 3 months before your first meeting with their representative. Mara thought about that first meeting. She'd been in the bakery on a Wednesday, doing inventory, and the representative had knocked on the glass door before opening hours. She'd thought the timing was odd. She'd let him in anyway because Ruth had raised her to hear people out. 22 months ago, she and Gavin had still been together for another 2 months. He had been, while he was still technically her partner, feeding information about her and her building to a development company. He provided them personal background on you, Kieran said. Not asking, he'd already seen the file. What kind of background? Your financial history, your relationship with the building owner, which at the time was still transitioning from your grandmother's estate, the names of your suppliers, a psychological assessment of your likely resistance threshold. He stopped. That last part was his own contribution, not requested. He volunteered it. Mara thought about Gavin Price sitting somewhere. His apartment, a coffee shop, a Meridian Capital conference room with the view of whatever city it overlooked, writing down what he knew about how she thought, what would move her, what wouldn't, how to apply the right kind of pressure at the right point to make her give up the things she'd built. Her hands were still. That was the thing she noticed about herself. Her hands were completely still, folded in her lap, and she was breathing normally, and the only sign that anything significant was happening inside her was the fact that she had not moved or spoken for almost 30 seconds. She had been with this man. She had believed during those 14 months that she was known by him. Not perfectly. They'd had friction, had argued, had operated on different frequencies about things that mattered. But the baseline assumption of a relationship was that the person across from you was not compiling a tactical dossier on your vulnerabilities for eventual commercial use. Vanessa, Mara said. From the information I have, Vanessa is not involved, Kieran said. She appears to be unaware. Mara looked at the trellis. Her cousin Vanessa, who was right now on the other side of this garden in an engagement dress with a diamond ring that had cost money. Gavin apparently expected to acquire through the financial dismantling of Mara's grandmother's bakery. The payout, Mara said, his commission, whatever he was expecting. A percentage of the development profit, Kieran said, which would have been considerable, enough to finance the life he's been building with Vanessa. On what timeline? Meridian's original close date was 8 months from now, if the project had proceeded on schedule. 8 months from now. Which would have been, Mara did the arithmetic automatically, 2 months after Vanessa and Gavin's planned wedding, based on the engagement announcement she'd seen on her phone. He'd planned the whole architecture of it, the engagement, the wedding, the life, built on money that was supposed to come from destroying what Mara's grandmother had built and what Mara had preserved. All of it assembled quietly, during the same period when Celeste Harrow's family had been gently and consistently implying that Mara was the one who hadn't figured out how to construct a real life. The project is dead, Mara said. Yes. As of 9:14 this morning, yes. So the money he was expecting, gone, Kieran said. The financing termination triggers a default clause in Meridian's development agreement. The whole structure comes apart. Whatever Gavin was promised becomes contingent on a project that no longer exists. Mara was quiet for a long moment. His phone has been ringing, she said. Yes, Kieran said. I imagine it has. She looked at him. Did you know this morning that you were going to tell me all of this today? I knew I needed to tell you. The timing, he paused, became more specific when you walked across a parking lot and told me my own name. Mara exhaled. It came out longer than she intended. I owe you an explanation for that. You don't, he said. I understand exactly what happened. And then, with a specificity that surprised her. Your aunt seated you at the children's table and then made a public joke about your romantic prospects while your ex-boyfriend sat at the adult table with your cousin. The lie was the only tool you had in that moment. It was a stupid tool. It worked, he said. Technically, Mara said, it only worked because the universe decided to be insane about it. Something in Kieran's expression shifted in a way she was starting to identify. The almost smile. It didn't fully materialize, but it changed the quality of his face enough that she felt it. We should go back, he said. Mara didn't move immediately. She sat on the cold stone bench with the rose trellis behind her, and the muffled sound of the string quartet resuming on the other side of the hedge, and the fact of Gavin Price's 18 months of operational betrayal sitting somewhere inside her chest like an object she'd swallowed that hadn't decided yet whether it intended to be digested. One thing, she said. Kieran waited. My grandmother fed you for 11 months, and you spent 17 years looking for a way to repay that. She looked at him directly. That's why the bakery is safe. Yes. Not because of me. Not because of anything I did. Kieran looked at her for a moment. Then he said with a precision she felt was intentional. You kept her recipes exactly. You didn't modernize them. You didn't sell when 3 different financial analyses said selling was the rational choice. You built something in a brutal market with no outside capital and no safety net, and you kept your grandmother's name on it. He paused. The bakery is safe because of Ruth Ellison, and because of what you chose to do with what she left you. Those things are connected, not separate. Mara absorbed that. She didn't have an answer for it. She wasn't sure she needed one. She stood up from the bench. Okay, she said. Okay? Let's go back. They walked from behind the rose trellis back into the main garden, and Mara felt the air change again. The warmer, more populated air of the party, the light landing differently now that it was further into the afternoon, the sounds reorganizing from muffled to present. She could see Celeste near the champagne table. She could see Deja talking to someone near the entrance. She could see Vanessa near the center of it all, still radiant, still laughing, still wearing the ring. She could see Gavin. He was standing at the edge of the garden near the gate, slightly apart from everyone, his phone in his hand and his face doing the work of a man trying to reassemble something that had already come apart. He hadn't looked up yet. He was reading something on his screen with the focused intensity of someone hoping the numbers might change if he looked at them long enough. Mara walked toward the center of the garden. She didn't have a plan. That was the true answer. She had information she hadn't possessed an hour ago, and she had a choice about what to do with it, and she had approximately 30 seconds before the party's social geometry would place her within speaking distance of her cousin, her aunt, and the man who had spent the better part of 2 years quietly working to take the most important thing she owned. Celeste materialized at her elbow with the efficiency of a woman who monitored room dynamics professionally. There you are. We were wondering. The two of you disappeared for the longest. Aunt Celeste, Mara said. Something in her tone stopped Celeste mid-sentence. A quality. Mara could hear it herself. Something had changed in the frequency of her voice, and she hadn't decided to change it. It had simply happened, the way things happen when enough has been removed that what remains is structural. Celeste blinked. Yes? Vanessa had looked over. Deja had looked over. 2 of the uncles had looked over because voices had texture, and they'd registered the change in Mara's. Gavin was still looking at his phone. I need to say something to everyone, Mara said. I think right now is the right time. Mara, Kieran said quietly from behind her. I know, she said. She knew he hadn't said it to stop her. She knew he'd said it to let her know he was there. She looked at the gathered faces of her family. Celeste's careful eyes. Vanessa's surprised ones. Deja's, which contained something that looked like recognition and the beginning of relief. And she felt the specific quality of a moment that you cannot step back from once you've entered it. Gavin finally looked up from his phone. He saw her expression, and whatever calculation he'd been running behind his eyes rearranged itself into something that looked, for the first time all afternoon, very much like fear. Mara opened her mouth, and 30 years of absorbing quiet diminishments from people who were supposed to love her, 30 years of making herself smaller so that others could feel comfortable in her presence, 30 years of sitting at children's tables and smiling at jokes made at her expense, and walking out of garden parties to cry in parking lots. All of it gathered itself into something that was not rage and not grief, but something older and quieter and considerably more. All of it gathered itself into something that was not rage and not grief, but something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous than either. She looked at Gavin Price. He was still holding his phone. His thumb had stopped moving on the screen. His face had the specific blankness of a man who had run several calculations simultaneously and found that none of them produced a favorable result. "Gavin," Mara said. Not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. The garden had done that thing it kept doing today, contracted around a moment of tension like a held breath. The string quartet had reached the natural end of a piece and hadn't started the next one yet, and in that gap Mara's voice landed with a clarity that reached every corner of the space. "I want to ask you something in front of everyone," she said. Vanessa had turned. Celeste had turned. Deja was very still near the entrance. The uncles, the aunts, the cousins, the caterers who had the good professional instinct to stop moving. Everyone had turned. Gavin put his phone in his jacket pocket. The gesture was smooth, practiced, the gesture of a man buying himself 2 seconds to reset. "Mara." He said her name like a door he was holding shut. "This isn't... Who is your contact at Meridian Capital?" The garden went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of before. This was a different frequency entirely. The quiet of people who understood something had shifted and were waiting to find out what. Gavin's jaw moved. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Meridian Capital," Mara said. "The development company that has been trying to acquire the property on Clover Street for the past 2 years. The company that sent 3 representatives to my bakery. The company that sent a legal letter my attorney called aggressively optimistic." She paused. "The company whose local liaison provided them with a psychological assessment of my resistance threshold." Vanessa made a sound. Small. Involuntary. Mara, I don't know where you're getting." 18 months, Mara said. Gavin stopped. "That's how long you've been their inside contact. 18 months, which means..." She did the math out loud deliberately, so everyone in the garden could follow it. "You started working with them 2 months before we broke up, while we were still together, while you were sitting in my kitchen, at the table I bought, in the building I own, telling me I needed to figure out what I wanted from my life." Something moved through this garden. She felt it. A kind of collective recalibration, the sound of people revising the story they'd been watching. Vanessa said, "Gavin." Not a question, a different thing. A reckoning dressed in 2 syllables. Gavin turned toward her and his face did something complicated. The machinery of a man who had 2 different performances running simultaneously and had just been informed he couldn't maintain both. "Vanessa, Is she right? It's not what she's making it. Is she right?" Vanessa's voice was steady. That surprised Mara, actually. She'd always known her cousin to run hot, to perform emotion for audiences. Right now, Vanessa's voice was completely flat and completely terrifying. "Were you working with a development company to push her out of her bakery?" "I was doing consulting work," Gavin said. "Market analysis, background information on the neighborhood. It was a professional." "On me," Mara said. "You provided background information on me, specifically, by name, including your assessment of how to pressure me most effectively into selling." "Mara, that is a significant..." "Do you want to call it something different?" Mara said. "You can call it something different. It won't change what it was." Gavin's mouth closed. For the first time today, he had nothing smooth to deploy. Celeste was standing 6 feet from Mara, with a champagne glass she had apparently forgotten she was holding, and her face was doing the calculation that Mara had watched it do all afternoon. But this time the calculation was different. This time the output was not social management. This time it was something rawer and less controlled. "Gavin," Celeste said, "what is she saying?" "She's saying," Kieran said from behind Mara, That the man you've spent today celebrating has spent the last 18 months working to financially dismantle your niece's business. He said it the way he said most things, without heat, without performance, with a precision that made it worse than if he'd shouted. A statement of fact delivered into a garden full of people who had spent years treating that niece like a footnote. Gavin turned to look at Kieran for the first time since they'd come back from behind the trellis. Something crossed his face, recognition or recalibration, or possibly the beginning of understanding about who exactly he'd been performing confidence in front of all afternoon. "I don't know who you think you are." "Kieran Vale," Kieran said. A pause. "I'm aware of your name," Gavin said. "Then you're aware," Kieran said, "that I hold a controlling interest in Arrowwood Consolidated." The color left Gavin's face in a way that was almost clinical to observe. Not gradually, quickly, like something draining. "Arrowwood funds Meridian Capital's development projects," Kieran said, for the benefit of everyone in the garden who was not following the financial architecture of what was happening. The Clover Street acquisition was running on Arrowwood financing. That financing was terminated this morning. He paused. "Which means the payment structure Gavin was expecting, the commission contingent on the project's success, no longer exists." Gavin's hand went to his jacket pocket. The phone. The phone that had been lighting up. The phone he'd been staring at with a face Mara had never seen on him before. "The calls you've been getting," Mara said quietly. "That's what they're about." Gavin said nothing. "How much?" Vanessa asked. Gavin looked at her. "How much were you expecting to make?" She said it with no inflection at all. "From destroying her bakery." "I wasn't destroying anything." "How much, Gavin?" The garden held its breath. Gavin's jaw tightened. He was doing the thing where he held his posture perfectly because he had no other leverage left. It was a percentage of development profit. The project was projected to... How much? "Enough," he said finally. "Enough to..." He stopped, glanced at the ring on Vanessa's hand, then glanced away. "To give us a real foundation." Vanessa looked down at her hand. She looked at the ring for a long moment. Long enough that the garden's held breath became something closer to pain. Then she looked up at Gavin. "A real foundation," she said. "Vanessa. Built on taking apart something that belonged to my family. She's not..." He caught himself, changed direction. "The bakery was going to be bought out eventually. The whole block was going to go. You gave them the information to pressure her more effectively," Vanessa said. "Specifically, you sat down and you wrote down what you knew about her, and you used it." She pulled in a breath. "You were with her when you did that." "We were almost over..." "Almost," Mara said. The word landed. "You were still in my kitchen," Mara said, and something had changed in her voice again. Not louder, not softer, something more stripped down than either, like speaking from a place that had been cleared of everything non-essential. "You were still calling me on the phone. There were still 3 weeks left before that conversation in my kitchen, where you told me I needed to figure out my life. And during those 3 weeks, you were already giving a corporation a roadmap to my pressure points." Gavin said nothing. There was nothing left in his vocabulary that worked. "I spent 2 years," Mara said, "thinking I wasn't enough. Not successful enough, not settled enough, not built enough somehow. Like there was something in me that needed more construction before I was worth showing up for." She heard her own voice doing something she hadn't entirely sanctioned, thickening slightly in a way that threatened to become something she absolutely would not let happen in front of this garden full of people. She steadied it. "You told me I needed to figure out what I wanted. And what I wanted was my grandmother's bakery. I built it. I kept it. I refused to sell it 3 times. And the whole time you were telling people exactly where to hit me." The garden was beyond quiet now. It was the silence of a space where something irreversible had been said. Celeste, to her credit, or possibly just in response to the magnitude of the moment, said nothing. She stood with her champagne glass and said absolutely nothing, which was the most notable thing Mara had ever observed her do. Vanessa pulled the ring off her finger. Not dramatically. No flourish, no thrown gesture. She simply removed it with 2 hands, the way you remove something you've been wearing that has become uncomfortable, and she placed it on the table beside her with a small, precise click of metal on wood. "Vanessa," Gavin said. "Don't," she said. "I can explain." "You did explain," Vanessa said. "That's what just happened. You explained." She pressed her lips together for a moment. I want you to leave. This is my... He stopped. Because it wasn't his anything. It was Celeste Harrow's garden. Vanessa. Leave, Gavin. He looked at the ring on the table. He looked at Vanessa's face. He looked at Mara. And for a moment she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see there, and that she was not, she realized, even satisfied by, which surprised her. She'd thought she would want his devastation. She'd thought watching Gavin Price's architecture collapse would feel like something won. It just felt like information, like learning the actual shape of something she'd been carrying wrong. He straightened his jacket. The gesture was so habitual, so deeply embedded in who he was, that it happened even now, as though the correct posture could still rescue something. Then he walked through the garden, past the champagne table, past the gift table where Mara's salted caramel tart sat at the far end, past the string quartet, who had developed the excellent professional discipline of looking at their sheet music, and out through the gate. Nobody spoke for approximately 4 seconds. Then Celeste sat down. She didn't find a chair first. She simply sat down into the nearest garden seat, which happened to be the arm of an upholstered bench, and she sat there with her champagne glass, and she looked at Mara. Mara, she started. Aunt Celeste. Mara's voice was very measured. I need a minute before you say what you're about to say. Celeste stopped. Mara stood in the middle of the garden and breathed. 1 breath, 2 breaths, the kind of deliberate inventory she took when the bakery's industrial oven had a problem at 5 in the morning, and she needed to assess what was actually broken before she could fix it. She looked at the space around her, the white linen, the trailing ivy, the brass lanterns starting to glow as the afternoon light thinned. She looked at Deja, who was looking back at her with bright eyes and a complicated expression. She looked at Vanessa, who had her hand pressed flat on the table where the ring was and was staring at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing a comprehensive reassessment of a significant period of their life. She looked at Kieran, who was slightly to her left, watching her with the patient alertness she'd been cataloging all afternoon, and who did not look like a man who wanted to tell her what to do with this moment. She thought about her grandmother. Ruth Ellison had never raised her voice at a family gathering, not once, in Mara's memory. She had simply moved through these spaces with the absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who knew her own worth and did not require it to be confirmed by anyone else's acknowledgement. Mara had spent 30 years trying to learn that, trying to get it into her body the way her grandmother had had it in hers. She wasn't sure she'd gotten there. She wasn't sure you ever got there. Maybe you just got closer. She turned to Celeste. I want to say something, Mara said, and I want to say it once. Celeste nodded. She'd done something Mara had never seen before. She'd put the champagne glass down. Her hands were in her lap. She looked, Mara thought, genuinely smaller than she had 4 hours ago. I know you love Vanessa, Mara said. I know you wanted today to be perfect, and I'm sorry that it isn't. She meant that. She checked herself and found she actually meant it. But I've been coming to these events for 30 years and sitting where you put me and smiling when you made jokes I wasn't supposed to react to and measuring myself against things you decided mattered. She stopped. Reorganized. The children's table today. That was... She shook her head once. I have a business. I have a team of 7 people who depend on me. I've kept a building on Clover Street through a financial climate that took out 4 of my neighboring businesses. I rebuilt the entire display case with my own hands when it broke because I couldn't afford to have it done. She looked at her aunt steadily. I don't need a husband to deserve a chair at your adult table. Celeste's mouth opened. And before you tell me you always knew I was special, Mara said, I need you to understand that respect you offer because you've just discovered someone's power is not actually respect. It's reassessment of your own position. The garden absorbed that. Bernadette, the nice aunt, had both hands pressed over her mouth. Celeste looked at her niece for a long, unperformed moment. Then she said quietly, not performing warmth, not deploying the management voice. You're right. Mara blinked. I know I do that, Celeste said. I know what I did. I've known it while I was doing it, and I did it anyway because... She stopped. And what crossed her face next was not what Mara expected, which was defensiveness or redirection. It was something older and less comfortable. Because my mother did it to me, and her mother did it to her. And I don't know what to do with that except to tell you that it was never a reflection of what you're worth. It was a reflection of what I was afraid of. The garden was so still that Mara could hear the lanterns above them shifting slightly in a small wind that had come up in the last few minutes. She didn't know what to do with what Celeste had said. She filed it, not forgiven, not dismissed, but filed with the particular care you give things that require more time to understand than you currently have. Okay, Mara said. Okay, Celeste said. I said what I needed to say. Mara looked at her aunt, her gathered family, the assembled witnesses of this afternoon. I'm not here to make a speech. I'm not here to fix anything. I said it because I needed to say it, and because... She glanced at Vanessa, who was looking at her with red-rimmed eyes and an expression that was part grief and part something that looked, improbably, like gratitude. Someone needed to say it today. She walked toward Vanessa. Vanessa made a sound somewhere between a breath and a word, and then stopped trying to categorize it and simply put her arms around Mara. They stood like that for a moment, two cousins who had spent their relationship in the specific configuration their family had arranged them in, one always slightly elevated, one always slightly reduced, and who were both in this moment just people standing in a garden where something had fallen apart and something else was unresolved. I didn't know, Vanessa said into her shoulder. I know, Mara said. I would never have... I know, Mara said. I know you wouldn't. Vanessa pulled back. Her eye makeup had done something architectural and complicated. She looked at Mara's face. Are you okay? I don't know yet, Mara said, honestly. I think I will be. Vanessa nodded. Then she looked past Mara's shoulder toward Kieran, and something in her expression became curious and slightly complicated. He's real, she said quietly. He's real, Mara confirmed. Are you actually? That's a conversation for another day. Vanessa almost smiled. Then she looked at the ring on the table, and the almost smile went away, and she looked very young suddenly, and very tired, and Mara squeezed her hand once before stepping back. She turned around. Kieran was standing where she'd left him. He hadn't moved during any of it. Not toward the confrontation, not away from it. He had stood at the edge of it like a witness rather than a participant, and she understood that had been a deliberate choice. She walked toward him. He looked at her face with an attention that felt, she was learning, like being actually seen rather than observed, and asked with no words whether she was all right. And she answered with no words that she wasn't sure, but she was standing up, and both of them understood the exchange had happened. Let's get out of here, she said. Yes, he said. She picked up her gift box, the remaining salted caramel tarts, which she had brought with love, and which had been placed at the far end of the table by someone who didn't understand what they were looking at. And she walked with Kieran Vale out of the garden. She did not look back. But she heard, behind her, Deja start to clap. One pair of hands, and then another, tentative, and then less tentative, and she did not turn around to see it because she didn't need to, and because Ruth Ellison had also never needed a room's applause to know when she'd done the right thing. The parking lot was almost completely empty of other people. Most guests had moved further into the garden as the afternoon deepened, and the caterers were operating around the back of the property, and the string quartet was packing their instruments with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had witnessed something and were professionally pretending they hadn't. The black sedan sat where Kieran had left it, exactly where Mara had first crossed the asphalt toward a stranger. She leaned against the brick wall beside the gate and felt the last 3 hours settle into her body like something physical. Her feet hurt. Her jaw hurt, which told her she'd been clenching it without registering. There was a tension across her shoulders that had been building since she'd seen her name on the seating chart next to little Marcus and had decided it was fine. It had not been fine. It had not been fine for a long time. You don't have to be okay right now, Kieran said. He was leaning against the car, arms crossed, looking at her. Not in the way you look at someone who needs managing, in the way you look at someone you're giving space to. I'm aware, Mara said. You're doing the thing where you're holding the structure together through force of habit. She looked at him. You've known me for 4 hours. 2 hours and 40 minutes of which I spent watching you perform stability for an audience, he said. I can tell when it stops being a performance and starts being what's keeping you from, he paused, sitting down in a parking lot. I'm not going to sit down in a parking lot, Mara said. No, he agreed. But you could. Something moved through her chest that was either very close to crying or very close to laughing, and she pressed it down and looked at the sky instead. The afternoon had gone fully golden now, The kind of light that made even parking lots look like they existed in a kinder world than they did. My grandmother knew you, Mara said. Yes. She never mentioned you. I imagine she had a lot of people she helped that she didn't mention. She had a book, Mara said. It wasn't really a book. It was a composition notebook with a faded cover, the kind you get at a drugstore. She kept it in the kitchen drawer next to the oven mitts. I used to think it was a recipe book, but she kept it face down whenever she was writing in it. She paused. When she died, I found it. It was full of names and dates, no other information, just names and dates. Kieran was very still. I counted them once, Mara said. There were 83 names. She looked at him. Were you in it? She asked. A long pause. I don't know, he said. You were there for 11 months. She kept track of everyone. Then probably, he said quietly. Mara thought about that notebook. She'd kept it, hadn't known why exactly, just that it felt wrong to throw it away. It was in a box in the back of her apartment closet with some of her grandmother's other things. 83 names and dates, 83 people whose trajectories had been, in ways large or small, interrupted by a woman who put food in front of them and said, "Sit down and eat." She never wanted to be paid back, Mara said. I know, Kieran said, but some things you do anyway, not because someone asked, because you can. Mara absorbed that. What happens now, she said. With Meridian, the development. They'll fold the Clover Street project. They don't have the financing to sustain it, and they don't have the timeline they promised the other sellers. The whole structure depends on your corner property, and you've made clear that's not available. He paused. They'll move on. There are other blocks. And Arrowwood won't fund another attempt. No, he said simply. It won't. Mara turned this over. The bakery was safe. Not saved today. Saved months ago, before she'd even known who Kieran Vale was. Before the parking lot. Before the children's table. Before Celeste's champagne toast that had cracked the particular pressure vessel Mara had been managing for 30 years. Saved by her grandmother's instinct to feed a hungry 19-year-old who had been drifting towards something darker. It was the strangest sentence she had ever had to hold. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. What you do? She looked at him directly. The real version, not acquisitions. He held her gaze for a moment. I acquire things, he said. Real answer. I also protect things. There are parts of what I've done and what I still do that are not... He stopped. Made a decision she could see him making. Not clean, by most definitions. My uncle turned white when he recognized your associate. Edmund has a particular history, Kieran said. And so do I. Is what you do illegal? Parts of what I've done were. What I do now, he considered, operates in spaces that are not always clearly defined. Mara looked at him for a long time. You're telling me this instead of performing something else, she said. You asked me a direct question. Most people don't answer direct questions directly. I'm aware, Kieran said. I'm not particularly interested in... He paused. The performance at this point. Mara thought about the bench behind the rose trellis and what he'd told her there. The boy of 19 arriving with nothing and angling toward a darkness and being interrupted by an old woman with a composition notebook and a cinnamon roll. She didn't know what to do with Kieran Vale. That was the honest answer. She didn't know if the geography of their lives, what his was, what hers was, mapped onto each other in any way that made sense. She didn't know if the gravitational pull of this afternoon was a thing that would survive contact with an actual Tuesday morning. She didn't know anything except that she was tired and her jaw hurt, and the bakery was safe. And the most important lie she'd ever told had conjured the right name in a parking lot outside a garden party that had somehow reorganized itself into something she hadn't expected when she'd ironed her dress twice this morning. My grandmother would have liked you, she said. Something happened in Kieran Vale's face that she had not seen there at any point in the last 4 hours. He looked for approximately 3 seconds, like a man who had not been told something like that in a very long time and did not know exactly where to put it. I liked her, he said. Mara nodded. She pushed off from the wall. She should go back in. There was probably a conversation with Vanessa she owed, and Deja deserved a real goodbye, and she had a gift box of tarts that she'd decided she was taking back home because no one at that party had deserved them. She should sort out the math of this afternoon into some kind of coherent sequence. She could process properly when she was alone in her apartment with a cup of tea and no audience. She should do a lot of things. Dinner, Kieran said. She stopped. Not today, sir, he added. Today has been enough. But he paused, in the way that she recognized now as him constructing a sentence that meant what he intended it to mean, and nothing he didn't. Dinner, sometime this week, a real one. No garden parties, no family audiences, no pretending anything. Mara looked at him. Just dinner, he said. She thought about $40 in her wallet and a name on a business card and a parking lot decision made from pure desperation. She thought about a woman in a notebook-keeping, cinnamon roll-making act of quiet grace that had traveled 17 years and returned with interest. She thought about her grandmother's hands, which she had watched make every recipe she had kept. You know, she said, when I asked you to be my boyfriend, you didn't ask anything about me first. No, he agreed. Most people would have asked questions. Most people, Kieran said, hadn't already spent 8 months reading a file on someone and developing a fairly complete picture. Mara stared at him. You read a file on me. A development intelligence report, he said. Which is different. Is it? It contained your business registration, your revenue history, your building purchase documentation, and a psychological assessment written by your ex-boyfriend, which I discarded as unreliable. Why unreliable? Because a man who walked away from you to work against you clearly didn't understand what he was looking at, Kieran said. The assessment read like someone describing a problem. I read it as a description of someone who knows exactly who she is. The parking lot held the last of the afternoon light. Mara's chest did something she declined to analyze in detail. Dinner, she said. Yes. This week. Yes. She looked at him for one more moment. This man she had invented. This man who had materialized from a name on a card, who had fed her when she forgot to eat and stood at her shoulder while she said the things she needed to say and answered her direct questions directly, and had, 17 years ago, been known by her grandmother in a kitchen on Clover Street. Okay, she said, and she walked back through the gate with her gift box under her arm and her shoes still hurting and her jaw finally starting to unclench into the remains of her cousin's engagement party. She had things to do. She had a cousin to check on, and an aunt to process, and a life to return to, a bakery that opened at 6 in the morning, a team who would be in at 5:30, a Tuesday that would begin with flour and butter and the old recipes, unchanged, exactly as they were supposed to be. She did not look back at the parking lot, but she heard the black sedan's engine start. And she thought, later. Later was, she was learning, a word that sometimes meant what it said. Inside the garden, Deja intercepted her within 10 seconds. Okay, Deja said. Okay, I need you to tell me everything. Can I eat something first? Yes, obviously. But then I'll tell you everything I can, Mara said. Deja handed her a plate, a proper one, piled with things from the adult table, and looked at her with eyes that were trying to hold several emotions at once and managing it with moderate success. The man in the parking lot, Deja said. Yes. Is actually named Kieran Vale. Yes. And he is actually complicated, Mara said. Yes. Deja looked at her for a long moment. But real. Real, Mara confirmed, and he knew Grandma Ruth. Mara stopped with the plate halfway to where she intended to eat at, finally, a proper table, and looked at her cousin. How did you— I heard some of it, Deja said quietly, from the trellis. I wasn't trying to. I was looking for you, and I heard your voice, and I just— She stopped. Her eyes went bright in a way that had nothing to do with the party. She kept track of people, you know. She would have kept track of him. I know, Mara said. She would have been glad, Deja said, that he found you. Mara looked at her cousin. She thought about the composition notebook in the box in her closet. 83 names, 83 dates. A woman who fed people without keeping score, except that she did keep score, quietly, in a notebook no one was supposed to see, the way you keep track of things you love. She thought about the fact that she had kept the notebook without knowing why. She thought about the fact that sometimes you carry things forward without understanding their destination. Yeah, Mara said. I think she would have been. She sat down at the adult table. Not because anyone had moved her. There were chairs available, The afternoon had rearranged things, and she simply pulled one out and sat in it. No announcement, no permission requested. She sat at the adult table with her plate of food and her gift box of tarts, and the specific, tired, unperformed quiet of a person who has said everything she needed to say and now simply needs to eat. Celeste, seated across the table, looked at her. She said nothing. She reached out and moved the flower arrangement that had been blocking Mara's sightline to the rest of the table. It was a small gesture. It was the smallest possible gesture. Mara let it mean what it could mean, and nothing more. She ate. Around her, the garden had resumed its sounds, people talking in smaller, quieter configurations, the caterers moving with renewed purpose, Bernadette organizing something near the gift table with the energy of a woman channeling strong feelings into practical tasks. Vanessa was sitting with two cousins near the roses, and Mara could see from here that she was doing the thing people do after a significant thing collapses, the systematic return to the body's requirements of water and breath, and the company of people who know your name. Mara ate her food. She was, she thought, going to be all right. Not today, entirely. Not with everything sorted and processed and resolved into its correct configurations, but eventually. In the way that things which have been built on an honest foundation are eventually all right, because the foundation holds even when the structure on top of it requires repair. Ellison and Rye opened at 6 tomorrow morning. She would be there at 5. The recipes were unchanged, the building was safe, and somewhere out in the parking lot, a black sedan had turned toward whatever came next, with a man in it who had answered her direct questions directly and who had known her grandmother by the particular method of being fed by her on 83 consecutive mornings, or however many it had been, in a kitchen that still smelled, if you knew where to stand, of brown butter and hand-ground spice. Mara finished her food. She picked up one of her grandmother's salted caramel tarts from the box and took a bite. It was, as it had always been, exactly right. The drive back to Clover Street took 47 minutes. Mara knew the route well enough to do it without thinking, which was good because her thinking was occupied with other things. The gift box sat on the passenger seat. The evening was coming in at the edges of the sky, that particular blue going dark that happened in late summer when the day had been long and the air still held the warmth of it, even as the light withdrew. She had the windows down. She had no music on. She drove through the city with the specific scraped-out quietness of a person who has used every available resource and is now operating on reserves. She parked behind the bakery. She sat in the car for a while. The building looked the same as it always looked. Brick, 3 stories, the signage above the front window that she'd painted herself in her grandmother's handwriting, the small potted bay laurels on either side of the entrance that she replaced every spring. The lights inside were off. The closed sign was in the window. It looked like what it was, a building that existed on a corner of a street in a city, doing nothing dramatic, simply standing. She thought about the development file that had crossed Kieran's desk, the photographs that would have been in it, aerial shots, street-level assessments, the kind of documentation that reduced places to coordinates and square footage. She thought about a young man in an expensive suit sitting across from her and saying the offer was generous, and the neighborhood was transitioning, and she should think about her future. She had thought about her future. Her future had cinnamon in it, and early mornings, and the weight of her grandmother's wooden rolling pin in her hands. She got out of the car. She unlocked the back door and went inside. The bakery after hours had its own specific atmosphere. Cooler than during service, the residual smell of everything baked that day settled into the walls and the counters and the wooden racks near the front window. She'd always loved it at this hour. When she was a child and her grandmother had brought her along for early morning prep, she'd slept on a folded apron on the flour sacks in the back until Ruth shook her awake at 5:30 for the first batch. The smell she'd woken up to then was the same smell as now, and some part of her nervous system had been calibrated to it so completely that she felt her shoulders drop 2 inches the moment she crossed the threshold. She put the gift box on the counter. She washed her hands at the prep sink, habit, ingrained so deep it happened before she consciously decided, and then she stood at the center of the kitchen with her clean hands and looked at the space she'd built. The oven Ruth had used was still here. Mara had replaced its internal components twice, but kept the original casing because it was the one her grandmother had stood in front of for 40 years. And it felt wrong to replace the outside of a thing when the important part was what it had witnessed. She opened the drawer next to the oven mitts. The composition notebook was not there, of course. It had been in her apartment for 6 years. But she stood with the drawer open for a moment anyway, looking at the ordinary contents. A bench scraper, a digital thermometer, a pen that probably didn't work anymore, the rubber bands she kept forgetting to throw away. The ordinary infrastructure of a working kitchen. She closed the drawer. She sat on the stool she kept at the end of the prep counter for the moments when her feet required a break from the standing, and she looked at her hands, and she let herself feel, without managing it or performing it or deciding in advance what shape it should take, the full accumulated weight of this particular day. Gavin's face when his phone rang. Vanessa placing the ring on the table with both hands. Celeste, for the first time in Mara's memory, putting down her champagne glass. Deja's single pair of hands starting the applause. And Kieran Vale, leaning against a black sedan in a parking lot, hearing his own name come back to him from the mouth of a woman he had spent 8 months reading reports about and had come to find. She let all of it exist for a while. She did not try to resolve it into a lesson or a revelation or a turning point. She just let it be an afternoon that had happened, the way afternoons happened, irreversible, specific, altering the landscape of the days that would follow by virtue of having occurred at all. Then she put on her apron. She didn't have a reason. The bakery was closed. There were no orders pending. Her prep team would be in at 5:30 tomorrow morning, and there was nothing that needed doing tonight. She put on her apron anyway because the apron was where she thought most clearly, and she had things she needed to think. She made dough. Not for any specific thing. Her hands found the proportions without being told. The flour, the butter worked cold into the mix, the precise temperature of water that her thermometer said was right, and her palm confirmed. She worked at the counter, and the motion of it settled something in her that the afternoon had left unsettled, and she thought about the composition notebook. 83 names. She had never looked up the names. After she found the notebook and understood what it was, she had held it for a long time and then put it in the box with her grandmother's other things and left it there, because looking up names felt like an intrusion into something Ruth had kept private for a reason. You didn't keep a notebook face down unless you understood that some records were not meant to be examined by other people. But she knew now that one of those 83 names was Kieran Vale. She knew what that name connected to. A 19-year-old arriving in a country with nothing, drifting towards something dark, interrupted by a brown butter cinnamon roll and a woman who said, "Sit down and eat. You look like you're carrying something heavy." She thought about what it cost to carry something heavy for 17 years, and then find, in a development file of all improbable locations, the shape of the thing you owed. She thought about what it cost to terminate your own investment to protect a bakery belonging to the granddaughter of the woman who had fed you. She worked the dough. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at the screen. "Deja, you good?" She typed back, "Yeah." "Home. Making dough for no reason." 3 dots appeared. Then, "That's how I know you're okay. When you're not okay, you stop baking." Mara looked at that message for a moment. Then, "How's Vanessa?" A longer pause this time. Then, "She's here. We ordered food. She's angry and sad, and I think probably okay eventually. She keeps saying she should have known. She couldn't have known. I told her that. She said the same thing you'd say, that it's easier to believe that from the outside." Mara thought about Vanessa removing the ring with both hands, the specific care of that gesture, like she was handling something that had unexpectedly become fragile. "I'll tell her the anger is good," Mara typed. "The anger means she's clear. I'll tell her." Mara, "Yeah, the thing you said today, about the children's table." Mara waited. "I should have said something, a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't." She held the phone and felt something in her chest that was complicated and warm, and not entirely resolved, but moving in a direction she recognized as right. "You started the clapping," she typed. "That's the least I could do." "It wasn't nothing," Mara said. She put the phone down and went back to the dough. She worked for another hour. The kitchen had gone fully dark outside the windows. The Clover Street streetlights were on, and the light from inside the bakery threw a warm rectangle onto the sidewalk the way it had in her grandmother's time. And she could see, if she looked up from the counter, the reflection of herself in the front window. A woman in an apron with flour on her hands and a dress she'd ironed twice still on underneath. She thought about Kieran saying, "You kept the recipes exactly." She thought about that as both the simple thing it was, a fact about how she ran the business, and as the other thing it was, The thing underneath the fact, which was that some forms of preservation were also a form of conversation. Every time she made the cinnamon rolls the way Ruth had made them, she was saying something to her grandmother that transcended the possibility of an answer. She was saying, "I heard you. I kept it. The thing you built with your hands is still here." She hadn't needed a powerful man to validate Ellison and Rye. She hadn't needed her family's approval of it, or Gavin's understanding of it, or Celeste's recognition that the children's table had been a diminishment. She had needed to make it every day. That was all. She had needed to show up and make the thing and keep making it and not sell it, and the making itself was the argument she'd been having with the world for 4 years. She'd won that argument. She just hadn't realized, until today, that she'd already won it. She wrapped the dough and put it in the cooler. She took off her apron. She turned off the kitchen lights. She stood for a moment in the dark of the front of the bakery, looking out through the window at Clover Street. The corner where her building stood was visible in both directions. Left toward the coffee shop that had survived, the cleaners that had been there for 30 years, the bookstore that opened Thursdays through Sundays because that was what worked for the woman who ran it. Right toward the 3 empty storefronts that Meridian Capital had already acquired, which would now, presumably, sit empty while the development company figured out what to do with assets it had purchased for a project that no longer existed. She thought about those 3 empty storefronts. She filed that thought under later, in the same place she was filing Kieran Vale, because some things required the specific clarity that came from a night's sleep and a 5:30 morning and the smell of the first batch in the oven. She locked the front door. She walked up the internal stairs to her apartment above the bakery. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table with the tea and the composition notebook, which she had retrieved from the box in the closet, not because she'd decided to, but because her hands had gone there while she was thinking about something else, which was its own kind of decision. She opened it. 83 names, dates beside each one, no other notation. Ruth Ellison had kept the record clean, stripped of narrative, just the fact of each person's presence. Some names appeared multiple times with a span of dates. Those would be the regulars, the people who came back. Some appeared once. She found his name on page 11. Kieran V. Ruth had only the first letter of his surname, which meant he'd either not offered it or she'd had reasons not to ask. With a start date and an end date 11 months apart. No other information. Just those dates, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, and the fact that he had been present. Mara sat with the notebook open to page 11 for a long time. She thought about the notebook she'd kept face down all those years. She thought about the 83rd name, the last one entered, written 6 months before Ruth died. She thought about whether her grandmother had known, at the end, what had been set in motion. Whether the connection between Kieran V and Ellison and Rye was something Ruth had understood was possible, or whether it was simply the long and improbable consequence of one unremarkable act of ordinary compassion. She thought it was probably the latter. She thought Ruth would have said, "That's how it works, baby. You don't know which ones come back." She closed the notebook. She finished her tea. She went to bed. Thursday morning, 8 days after the party, Mara was behind the counter at 6:43 when the front door opened and a woman she didn't recognize came in. Late 40s, suit jacket over a practical dress. Hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who got up early and had things to do. She looked at the display case with the direct assessment of a person making an actual decision rather than browsing. "The cinnamon," she said. "Is it made the traditional way? No extract?" "Brown butter base," Mara said. "Hand-ground spice. My grandmother's method." The woman looked at her. "You're Mara Ellison." "Yes." "I'm Andrea Cole. I'm an attorney." She set a card on the counter. "I represent 3 former tenants of properties on this block who sold under pressure to Meridian Capital. Now that the development project has collapsed, they're exploring whether the sale terms were conducted under duress." Mara looked at the card. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you a coffee." Andrea Cole sat at the counter stool and looked at the display case with the focused expression of a woman who had already decided she was staying a while. "The other property owners on the block," Mara said, putting the coffee in front of her. "Do you know what Meridian plans to do with the properties now that the project is dead?" "That's unclear. They're in a holding pattern while they assess their options." Andrea wrapped both hands around the mug. "There's a possibility that they'll look to sell at a loss to recoup some of the acquisition costs." Mara thought about the 3 empty storefronts. She thought about the conversation she'd been filing under later. What would that process look like, she said. It would depend on whether there's a motivated buyer, Andrea said, and on what the buyer's intention was for the properties. Mara looked at the display case, at the cinnamon rolls, the salted caramel tarts, the brown sugar kuianaman that had been her grandmother's weekend special and that she'd reintroduced 3 months ago to lines out the door every Saturday. She thought about the bookstore that opened Thursdays through Sundays, the coffee shop, the cleaners. She thought about what a block looked like when it was intact versus what it looked like when it had been strategically hollowed. I might want to have a more detailed conversation about that, Mara said. Andrea Cole looked at her over the coffee mug. I thought you might, she said. She ate the cinnamon roll. She did not say anything else for a moment, and Mara understood that the silence was its own kind of assessment. Then Andrea said simply, Your grandmother made these. Mara's hand stilled on the counter. You knew her? I came in a few times when I was in law school, Andrea said. I was living nearby. She gave me a corner table and never asked me to order more than I could afford. She paused. I heard what happened with the development project. The financing termination, the inside connection. She looked at Mara steadily. Word travels in certain circles. What circles? Mara said carefully. Circles adjacent to Kieran Vale, Andrea said without particular emphasis. For what it's worth, in those circles, what happened here is considered significant. Mara absorbed this without changing her expression, which required some effort. I don't work for him, Andrea said. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because the former tenants came to me and because I did my research on the block and the bakery came up every time. She paused. And because I thought Ruth Ellison's granddaughter should probably know that she has more options than she might currently be seeing. Mara thought about the composition notebook in her apartment. She thought about 83 names, about the ways that one person's quiet acts moved through the world in directions you couldn't track and didn't try to. Come back tomorrow, Mara said, earlier, before opening. I'll have coffee and we'll talk properly. Andrea Cole nodded. She put the money for the coffee and the roll on the counter, more than it cost, but not by an amount that was patronizing, by an amount that was simply generous. And she put on her jacket and she left. Mara stood behind her counter and watched Clover Street through the front window. A school-age kid went by on a bicycle. One of her regular morning customers, Mr. Petrakis, 68, 2 sugars, always the same seat by the window, appeared at the corner and began his approach with the unhurried pace of a man who had been making this walk since before the neighborhood had changed around him. She unlocked the front door. She turned the sign to open. The dinner happened on a Wednesday. She'd almost called to reschedule twice, once because a supplier issue required 3 phone calls in most of Tuesday afternoon, and once because she stood in front of her closet for 8 minutes and felt a specific and irrational anxiety that she had not expected to feel and that irritated her by being there. She went anyway. Kieran had suggested a place she hadn't been to. A small restaurant, not ostentatious, the kind of place that had existed in the same location for 20 years and that people found through other people rather than through being conspicuous. He was already there when she arrived, which she noticed, and he stood when she came in, which she also noticed, and neither of these things was remarkable and both of them registered. They sat across from each other at a table that was the appropriate size for 2 people who were not yet entirely sure of the geography between them, and they looked at the menus for a moment with the shared performance of people who were not primarily interested in the food. How's the bakery? He said. Open, she said. Always open. She put the menu down. I met with an attorney this week, Andrea Cole. He nodded once, which told her he was not surprised. She told me she doesn't work for you. She doesn't, he said, but she's adjacent to you. There are people who know me in various capacities, he said. Andrea is a good attorney who was Ruth's customer. Those 2 facts are unrelated to each other except that they both led her to your door. Mara looked at him. The Meridian properties. Yes. The 3 storefronts. Yes. I want them, Mara said. Kieran said nothing, waiting. Not for me, specifically. The cleaners that sold, they want to come back, their owner told me. The bookstore has been looking for expanded space for 2 years. There's a woman in this neighborhood who has been trying to open a lunch spot for 4 years and has been consistently outpriced. She paused. 3 storefronts correctly acquired and offered at appropriate terms could rebuild what Meridian spent 2 years pulling apart. And the acquisition capital, Kieran said. I have some options I'm exploring, Mara said. Andrea has thoughts. I have a bank relationship I've been careful with for 4 years. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to fund it. I know, he said. I'm telling you because it involves your former investment vehicle, and I thought you should know what I'm thinking about doing in the neighborhood where your money was pointed. That's fair, he said. Also, Mara said, I wanted your opinion. As someone who does this professionally, not as a favor, as someone with information I don't have. Kieran looked at her for a moment. The distressed asset pricing on those properties will be favorable, he said. Meridian needs liquidity and they have no development path. If you have a credible offer and a coherent plan, they'll take it. He paused. The bank relationship. Have you spoken to them about commercial acquisition rather than just operational financing? That's the conversation I'm having next week. Before that conversation, he said, there are 2 specific provisions you should ask about that most small business owners don't know to request. He named them. Precise, technical, the kind of information that came from having done this repeatedly on a scale she hadn't operated at. She listened carefully and did not write it down because she would remember. Thank you, she said. It's information, he said, not a favor. I know the difference, she said. He almost smiled. I know you do. They ordered food. They ate. The conversation moved through territory that was not the bakery, and not the development project, and not Gavin Price, and not Celeste's garden. It moved through the ordinary and specific terrain of 2 people learning who the other person was when the drama wasn't present to do the work. He had opinions about things she hadn't expected. He read history with the intensity other people brought to current events, and had thoughts about mid-century urban planning that were specific and considered and occasionally contrarian. He had cooked, when he was younger, because it was either cook or not eat, and still did it with the unceremonious practicality of someone for whom it was never a hobby. She told him about the early years of the bakery, not the successful entrepreneur version she gave to journalists and grant applications, but the real version, the months when she'd paid the suppliers before she paid herself, the morning she'd found water coming through the ceiling during the winter rush, and had used every towel she owned to manage the damage until a plumber could come and had still opened an hour late and had cried in the back after the morning rush was done because she hadn't had anyone to call. He listened the way he did everything, entirely. You didn't call anyone, he said. There wasn't anyone who wouldn't have turned it into a reason I should reconsider, she said. Your family. They would have been kind about it, she said. Celeste would have been kind about it in the specific way where you feel worse after. She looked at her hands around the water glass. It's a particular skill she has. Had, Kieran said. Mara looked at him. She called this bakery Monday morning, he said. I know because Edmund mentioned he intercepted a call for me at my office, and the caller identified herself as Celeste Harrow and asked for contact information for Kieran Vale. Edmund told her he'd pass the message. What did she want? She wanted to make a reservation, Kieran said, for herself and 3 family members. She specified that she wanted to pay full price and that she was interested in whether the bakery offered catering for private events. Mara stared at him. Edmund passed the message to me, Kieran said. I passed it to you just now. She's going to come into the bakery, Mara said. It appears so. And she's going to, what? Order things. It appears that way. Mara thought about this. About Celeste Harrow, who had run the social geometry of her family for as long as Mara had been conscious of there being a geometry to run, picking up a phone and calling a bakery to make a reservation. The act itself was not enormous. The act itself was just a phone call. But it was a specific phone call placed specifically, and Mara understood the coordinates of it. She's trying, Mara said. Yes, Kieran said. It doesn't fix anything. No, he agreed. But it's... She stopped. Considered. It's something. It's the beginning of something, he said. Whether it becomes anything is a longer timeline. Mara thought about the composition notebook. About 83 names and no other information. Just the fact of each person having been present and her grandmother having kept track without keeping score. She thought about the ways that people tried, imperfectly, to correct the things they'd done wrong, and how you decided what to do with those attempts when they came. She was not required to make that decision tonight. She was allowed to let it sit in the later pile, where a number of things were currently residing, and see what they looked like when they'd had time to settle. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," Kieran said. "The morning you terminated the Arrowwood financing, 9/14. Yes. You'd known about the bakery for 8 months. You'd read the file. You'd seen the recipes." She held his gaze. "Why that morning?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the considering kind of quiet. The kind where the answer was already assembled, but the question was whether to give the whole of it. "I'd been trying to identify the correct response for 8 months, he said. "Terminating the financing was straightforward, technically. The question was what came after, whether I could approach you directly, whether you would want that, whether the connection to your grandmother was something that belonged to you to know about or something that would feel like an intrusion." He paused. "I'm not practiced at this kind of thing. At approaching people. At approaching people without a defined purpose," he said. "I'm good at purposeful contact, meetings, negotiations, clear objective, clear method." He looked at his water glass. "The idea of walking into your bakery and saying, 'Your grandmother fed me for 11 months and I terminated an investment in your neighborhood because of it,' requires a different set of tools that I have less of." Mara thought about this. "So what changed on Wednesday morning?" "I was in the car outside my office," he said. "I had the Arrowwood termination documents ready to sign. I had my driver waiting. I was going to sign them and then figure out the rest of it later." He looked at her. "Edmund asked me where we were going after the signing. I didn't have an answer. So he said, 'You said you were going to find the bakery owner. You've been saying that for 2 months. If not now, when?'" A pause. "Edmund is not usually that direct." "What did you say?" "I said that was the right question and signed the documents," Kieran said. "And then I looked up the Harrow address because the property file showed you'd been tagged in an engagement party invitation posted to a shared family account, and I thought finding you at a family gathering would be less abrupt than walking into your place of business unannounced." Mara looked at him across the table. "That plan," she said, "resulted in you standing in a parking lot where a woman came up and offered you $40 to pretend to be her boyfriend." "Yes," he said, "and the boyfriend's name happened to be yours." "Yes." "Do you understand," Mara said, "how completely insane that is?" "I've had 8 days to think about it," he said. "Yes." She felt the laugh before it came, a real one, not the managed almost laugh she'd been deploying all afternoon at the party, but a full one that came from somewhere involuntary and arrived complete. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with an expression she would need more time to fully catalog. But that was, in its basic structure, the expression of a man experiencing something that didn't happen to him often and that he was not trying to stop. $40, he said. "I had 60 in my wallet," she said, still laughing. "I thought 40 seemed more reasonable. For 1 hour. I didn't know how else to price it." "Reasonable," he said, and the almost smile arrived fully for perhaps the second time she'd seen it. And it changed his face in a way that she decided she was going to need to stop analyzing and simply allow. He walked her to her car. It was a simple thing. The restaurant was 4 blocks from the parking structure, and they walked those 4 blocks in the particular October air that felt like summer making its last argument and losing. And she told him about the Queen Amman and the Saturday line, and he told her about a city he'd lived in briefly at 22 that had a bakery on every corner and a different understanding of what bread was supposed to be. And they walked slowly because neither of them was in a hurry. At the car, she turned and looked at him. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Something that's not connected to the bakery, or my grandmother, or the development project." He thought about it. Genuinely. She could see the consideration. "I don't sleep well in quiet," he said. "I need sound, traffic, something. Quiet rooms keep me awake." "Why?" "Old habit," he said. "From a time when quiet meant something was wrong." She absorbed that, heard the shape of a life in it without needing the details. "I'm afraid of escalators," she said. He blinked. "Not elevators. Not heights. Specifically escalators. I've been afraid of them since I was 7 and I walked up a down escalator on a dare and fell." She looked at him levelly. "I take the stairs or the elevator at every building I enter. It adds time to my day." "Every building," he said. "Every building." He looked at her with the full attention that she had spent 3 weeks getting gradually accustomed to, and not yet fully accustomed to. The building where my office is, he said, has both an elevator and stairs. Good, she said. I'm letting you know in advance, he said. In case you're there. She looked at him. Not soon, he said. I'm not assuming. I'm just letting you know in advance. That's very practical of you, she said. I try to be practical, he said. She put her hand on the car door handle. Call me, she said, not through Edmund. I'll call you myself, he said. Good. Mara. She looked at him. I'm glad you came across the parking lot, he said. She thought about the $40 and the desperate arithmetic and the broken pressure valve of 30 years of absorbing quietly, and the name she'd pulled from a business card and breathed into existence, and what that name had turned out to be connected to. So am I, she said. She got in the car. She drove back to Clover Street with the windows down and the October air doing its last argument thing, and she parked behind the bakery and sat there for a moment looking at the building's back wall, the familiar brick, the outline of the bay laurels visible around the corner. She thought about the 3 empty storefronts. She thought about Andrea Cole's card on her kitchen counter, and the bank meeting next week, and the provisions Kieran had named that she was going to ask about. She thought about what it meant to build something in the image of something that had already been built, not copying it, but continuing it. The way a sentence continues while remaining the same sentence. The cleaners that wanted to come back. The bookstore needing space. The woman with the lunch spot who'd been outpriced for 4 years. A block could be rebuilt. Not perfectly. Not without the specific losses of the storefronts that hadn't survived the pressure and wouldn't be coming back. But something could be built in the space that remained, and Mara Ellison was, by documented and court-tested professional experience, someone who built things in spaces other people considered compromised. She went upstairs. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook open to page 11, and she looked at her grandmother's handwriting, Kieran V. and the dates, for a while. Then she turned to the last page of the notebook. The 83rd name. She'd read it before and not recognized it. She'd read all the names in the first week after Ruth died, and none of them had meant anything to her except as evidence of the texture of her grandmother's life. She read the 83rd name now with different information behind her eyes. She sat very still. Then she turned back to page 11. Kieran V. Then to the last page. The 83rd name, written 6 months before Ruth died, with a date that was 8 months before Mara had decided to open Ellison and Rye in her grandmother's building. The name on that last page was not a stranger. It was Andrea Cole. Mara sat with that for a long time, with what it meant that the attorney who had come to her door with information about the Meridian properties had also once sat at a corner table in Ruth Ellison's bakery, unable to afford more than coffee, with what it meant that Ruth had been keeping track of the people who had passed through her kitchen. Not because she expected anything from them, but because she cared about the fact of their existence. With what it meant that 2 of her grandmother's 83 had found their way back to Clover Street within the same month. She thought about the word network and found it insufficient. She thought about the word legacy and found it too large and too formal. She thought about what Ruth would have called it and found the answer immediately, because it was what Ruth called everything she cared about. People, baby, she would have said. You take care of people and you don't keep score, and eventually the people take care of each other. That's all it is. That's all it was. Mara closed the notebook. She finished her tea. She went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was unusual for her, and she slept without difficulty, which was not unusual at all, because she had always been able to sleep in her grandmother's building, and the building had always felt like a held thing, held in place by history and recipes, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had kept her doors open for 40 years and taught her granddaughter to do the same. 1 year later, the 3 storefronts on Clover Street were open. The cleaners had come back under a new name. The owner's daughter had taken over and expanded the service offering and put her own grandmother's name on the window in the same block lettering the family had used for 30 years. The bookstore had moved into the largest of the 3 spaces and now opened 5 days instead of 4 and had a small reading room in the back that hosted events on Saturday evenings. The lunch spot, run by a woman named Carla, who had been trying to open it for 4 years and who had wept briefly in Mara's kitchen when the terms were finalized, did a steady business from 11 to 3 and closed promptly so Carla could be home when her kids got off the school bus. Ellison and Rye was still on the corner. It had always been on the corner. It would continue to be on the corner for as long as Mara had anything to say about it. She had not expanded the menu. She had expanded the hours slightly and added a second prep person on Saturdays, and replaced the display case that had needed replacing for 2 years and that she'd been fixing with strategic placement of serving stands and determination. The oven with its original casing was still there. The recipes were unchanged. The composition notebook was in the drawer beside the oven mitts now, where it had lived during Ruth's time. Mara had moved it there 6 months ago without overthinking it. It belonged in the kitchen, not in a closet. Some things needed to be where they could be found. She had not added any names to it. She had thought about it, and then thought about the fact that her grandmother had not kept the notebook as an instruction, and that each person had to find their own way of keeping track of what mattered. She would find hers. On a Tuesday in November, 11 months after the engagement party, Mara arrived at a family gathering alone. Celeste's house again. Smaller event this time, a birthday. Her Uncle Bernard turning 70, with the resigned good humor of a man who had stopped pretending he felt otherwise about large numbers. Mara drove the same route she'd driven to the garden party, parked in a street spot rather than the lot, and walked up to the front door with a box of birthday cake from the bakery. She did not feel anxious. That was the thing she noticed most. Not the absence of something bad, but the presence of something different. The specific quality of walking toward a room full of people who had at various times diminished her, and at other times tried, and at other times simply been imperfect in the ordinary human ways that most people were imperfect, and feeling her own feet on the ground and her own breath in her chest, and her own hands holding the cake box, and knowing that was enough. She didn't need the room to confirm anything. The room was going to be whatever it was going to be. She was going to be who she was regardless. Deja opened the door and hugged her immediately, and then looked at the cake box and said, "Please tell me it's the lemon one." And Mara said it was, and they went inside. Vanessa was there. She looked different from a year ago, not thinner or more polished or any of the visual changes people sometimes made after something had broken. She looked more settled, less performing, like someone who had removed a weight and was still learning the posture of not carrying it. She crossed the room to Mara and they hugged. The kind of hug that was not about the engagement party or Gavin or the ring on the table, but about two cousins who had been shaped by the same family and were still, on the other side of all of it, in each other's lives. "How's the block?" Vanessa said. "Coming back," Mara said. Vanessa smiled. "Carla's lunch spot?" "Sold out of the soup again this week. She's going to add a third option, and I told her to wait until spring." "You're a good neighbor," Vanessa said. "I had a good example," Mara said. Celeste appeared at Mara's elbow 20 minutes into the party. This was perhaps the conversation Mara had filed under later the longest. What Celeste would be on the other side of everything. What the recalibration of that particular relationship meant, and what shape it would take going forward. Celeste had come to the bakery. Twice. She had ordered coffee and the cinnamon roll both times and had not performed anything complicated about it. No elaborate apology, no revisionist history, just a woman sitting at a counter eating a roll she hadn't given proper credit to before. The second time she'd come, she'd brought Bernard's wife, who was 67 and had a sweet tooth and who had declared the salted caramel tart the best thing she'd eaten in a decade, which Mara had accepted with a thank you and without the performance of it meaning more than it meant. Now Celeste stood beside her at Bernard's birthday party and looked at the room and said, "The block looks good. I drove past last week." "Thank you," Mara said. "Your grandmother would have liked it." "Yes," Mara said. "She would have." A pause. Celeste was looking at the cake box on the table, which had been opened to reveal the lemon layer cake with the candied zest on top, which was doing exactly what good desserts did at a party, drawing people toward it simply by existing. "I keep thinking," Celeste said, "about what you said, about respect you offer after you know someone's power." Mara waited. I can't give you a clean answer for it," Celeste said. "I've been trying to find one." She looked at her hands. "I think the most honest thing I can say is that I saw what I was afraid of in you. Someone who didn't need what I thought everyone needed to be legitimate. And I didn't—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't know how to be comfortable with that." "And now?" Mara said. Celeste looked at her. "I'm learning to be uncomfortable," she said. "I'm 71. It turns out there are things you can still learn at 71. Mara looked at her aunt for a long moment. This woman who had arranged seating charts and wielded warmth like a precision instrument, and who had also, in a garden, put down her champagne glass and said two words that had cost her something. "You're right." "Okay," Mara said. "Okay?" "That's an honest answer," Mara said. "I can work with an honest answer." Celeste nodded once, quickly, and then said she needed to check on the food, which was the Celeste Harrow way of exiting a moment before it became too much of a moment, and Mara let her go. Deja appeared at her side. "That looks significant," Deja said. "It was something," Mara said. "Good something or complicated something?" "Both," Mara said, "but mostly good." Deja handed her a glass of water, and they stood together watching Bernard try to refuse the birthday sash his grandchildren were attempting to put on him, and Mara felt, under the sounds of the party and the warm indoor light of her family gathered in a room, the particular quality of something that had been tight for a long time beginning, slowly and without announcement, to loosen. 20 minutes later, the front door opened. Kieran came in. Not with an entrance, he was constitutionally incapable of making entrances. She'd established that definitively. He simply came in, found her face across the room the way he'd found it in parking lots and gardens, and across restaurant tables, and moved toward her without hurrying. Deja made a small, controlled sound beside her that was trying to be inaudible and wasn't entirely. "I'll be over there," Deja said, and moved away with the studied casualness of a woman who was absolutely going to watch everything from a short distance. Kieran reached her. He was wearing something slightly less formal than the jacket she'd first seen him in. Not casual, not performed, just a version of himself that was marginally less armored, which she understood by now was the equivalent for him of arriving in jeans. "Bernard's birthday?" he said. 70, she said. "He looks unhappy about it." "He's delighted. He just can't perform delight without looking undignified." Kieran looked at her for a moment. "How are you doing?" "Good," she said. And then, because she'd stopped performing stability for people who hadn't earned the real answer, "Better than last year, by a significant amount." "Yes," he said. "I can see that." She had learned over the past months that when he said he could see something, he meant it in the precise sense that he had observed it, cataloged it, and was reporting the observation as a fact. It was not a romantic flourish. It was just Kieran Vale being accurate. She found it still considerably more affecting than most people's flourishes. "You talked to Andrea," she said. "She called me about the zoning classification on the third storefront," he said. "Procedural question." "She told me." "Is that all right?" "She also told me you referred her two additional clients last month," Mara said. He said nothing. "Kieran. They came to me with problems she was suited to handle," he said. "I made a referral." "From a development intelligence report?" "From an active list," he said, "of people your grandmother kept track of." Mara went very still. "The notebook," she said. "You know about the notebook." "Andrea mentioned it," he said carefully. "She said Ruth had kept records, that she was in it." "You didn't look for yourself." "No," he said. "It wasn't mine to look for." She thought about page 11, his handwriting, the dates. "You're in it," she said. "Page 11. He breathed in once. "I know." "She wrote down everyone who mattered to her," Mara said. "Not everyone who came in, just the ones she paid attention to." Kieran was quiet for a moment. "She paid attention to a lot of people," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "She did." They stood together in her uncle's living room, in the middle of her family's noise and warmth and ordinary imperfect humanity, and Mara thought about her grandmother keeping the notebook face down and never expecting the names in it to find each other, and about how sometimes the things you did without expectation were the ones that traveled the furthest and landed in the most improbable places. She thought about a parking lot. She thought about $40. She thought about a name she'd pulled from a card and spoken into the air, and what that name had been connected to, and how none of it was a story about being rescued or discovered or validated by someone else's power. It was a story about the particular persistence of her grandmother's ordinary compassion traveling through 17 years and arriving, in the form of a man in a parking lot and an attorney with an office downtown and a block of storefronts finding their way back to the people who belonged in them, at exactly the moment Mara Ellison had stopped being willing to absorb the world's diminishments quietly. She had not needed Kieran Vale to make her worthy. She had needed this day to understand that she already was. He was standing beside her, not in front of her, not behind her. Beside her, at the pace she set, which she had observed was how he consistently operated and which she had stopped pretending she didn't find significant. "Bernard's trying to eat the cake before the song," she said. "Should we intervene?" "Absolutely not," she said. "Let the man eat his cake." Something moved across Kieran's face. The full version of the almost smile arrived completely and without reservation, and it changed his whole face the way light changes a room when someone finally decides to open the curtains. She did not look away from it. She let it be exactly what it was. Outside on Clover Street, the November evening was doing its work. The lights coming on in the shops, the cleaner's window warm through the dark, the bookstore with its hand-lettered event notice in the glass, Carla's lunch spot closed for the day with a chalkboard sign that said, "See you tomorrow," in Carla's handwriting, which was exuberant and slightly chaotic and perfect. The corner building stood as it had always stood, on the corner where it had always been, with the signage above the window in Ruth Ellison's handwriting and the bay laurels out front that Mara replaced every spring. Inside, in the drawer beside the oven mitts, a composition notebook held 83 names. And on Clover Street the lights burned and the evening settled, and the block held as things that are built on honest foundations hold. Not perfectly, not without repair, but permanently, in the only sense that permanence ever truly means anything, which is this: it was here today, and tomorrow it would still be here. And the people who had built it and kept it and returned to it would come back in the morning and open the doors. And the morning would begin, as it always had, with flour and butter and the old recipes, exactly as they were, unchanged.